I spent 40 years wiping engine grease off my hands so my daughter could wear silk. But on her wedding day, standing in the middle of a five-star ballroom, her new father-in-law decided I was a stain that needed to be washed away. He threw a glass of ice water right in my face in front of 600 elite guests. The room went dead silent. He expected me to lower my head, apologize for my mere existence, and walk out the back door like a beaten dog. Instead, I slowly reached into my tailored suit, pulled out a radio, and gave a single command that erased his entire corporate empire in less than 60 seconds. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed the Sterling family, let me know what city you are listening from down in the comments. And if you believe that true power never has to shout, hit that like and subscribe button. The freezing water hit my face with the force of an open-handed slap. Ice cubes bounced off my chest and shattered against the polished Italian marble floor of the Grand Monarch Ballroom. For a moment, the only sound in that massive, opulent space was the dripping of water from my chin onto my crisp white shirt. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped. The soft playing of the string quartet in the corner died out in a discordant scrape of a bow. 600 guests, the absolute pinnacle of the city's wealthy white elite, froze in their tracks and turned their eyes toward me. Standing less than 2 feet away from me was Richard Sterling. He held the empty crystal glass in his hand, his posture rigid with arrogant satisfaction. Richard was a man who wore his generational wealth like a heavy cologne. He had the kind of perfect silver hair and tailored tuxedo that screamed old money, but his eyes were entirely bankrupt of basic human decency. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper designed to cut me down to nothing. "Time to wake up, old mechanic." Richard sneered, a cruel smile stretching across his face. "You might have bought a nice suit for today, but do not ever mistake yourself for one of us. Your place is not up here on the main stage standing next to my son. Your place is in the back, out of sight, where you belong." The venom in his words was carefully measured. It was the culmination of months of subtle disrespect, condescending glances, and thinly veiled racism disguised as upper-class etiquette. He looked at me and saw nothing but a 74-year-old black man from the south side of Chicago. He saw a retired auto mechanic who lived in a small, weathered house. He saw a man who had somehow gotten lucky enough to have a brilliant, beautiful daughter, but who remained fundamentally beneath him. I did not raise my hand to wipe the water from my face. I did not blink. I did not step back. I just stood there letting the cold drops run down my neck, absorbing the absolute magnitude of his mistake. My eyes shifted from Richard to the groom, Connor Sterling, the man who had just sworn before God to protect and cherish my daughter Maya. Connor was standing right beside his father. He was a tall, handsome man with a smile that could sell a bridge to nowhere. But right now, that smile was gone, replaced by a pathetic, cowardly grimace. Connor looked at me dripping wet and publicly humiliated, and he did absolutely nothing. He just averted his gaze and stared at the floor, perfectly willing to let his father degrade the man who had given him his bride. And then I looked at Maya, my beautiful Maya, standing in her breathtaking white gown a few yards away. Her hands were covering her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror and disbelief. She had spent the last year defending these people to me. She had begged me to ignore their microaggressions, telling me that the Sterlings were just traditional, that they just took time to warm up to outsiders, that Connor was different from his father. Now the illusion was completely shattered. The mask had fallen off, and the ugly, raw truth was standing right there in the middle of the dance floor. Richard let out a soft, dismissive scoff, clearly mistaking my silence for submission. He turned his back to me, raising a hand to signal the band to start playing again, ready to resume his perfect evening after disposing of the trash. He thought he had won. He thought he had put me in my place. What Richard Sterling did not know, what his cowardly son did not know, and what even my own daughter did not fully understand, was that they were not standing in front of a broke, retired mechanic. They were standing in front of a man who owned the very ground beneath their expensive leather shoes. I slowly inhaled the scent of the expensive lilies decorating the tables. I looked up at the massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. I looked at the 600 guests who were watching me with a mixture of pity and disgust. And then very calmly I reached my right hand inside the breast pocket of my suit. I did not pull out a handkerchief to dry my face. I pulled out a heavy-duty encrypted security walkie-talkie. Richard's smug smile faltered as he caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned back around, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his features. "What on earth are you doing?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its confident edge. "Are you calling a cab? Good. Use the service exit." I pressed the transmit button on the side of the radio. The sharp beep echoed clearly in the quiet tension of the ballroom. I locked eyes with Richard, and for the first time that night I let him see the monster hiding behind the mechanic's calloused hands. "Do you really know who you just insulted?" I asked. My voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. Before he could answer, I spoke directly into the radio. "This is Marcus Blackwood. Lock down every exit in the Grand Monarch. No one leaves. And bring the main projector screen down on the stage right now." The confusion on Richard's face deepened rapidly, morphing into something resembling panic. He looked around the room, trying to understand why I was speaking as if I commanded the building. He had no idea that the name Blackwood Holdings was about to become the absolute nightmare of his existence. To understand why I let them humiliate me to this extreme point, to understand why I stood there and took their insults for months without saying a single word, we have to rewind the clock. Because the trap that was about to completely obliterate the Sterling family did not start tonight. It started exactly 3 months ago across a very tense dinner table when they made the fatal mistake of trying to steal the only thing I had left of my past. 3 months before the water hit my face, the real insult was served over a plate of overpriced duck. Richard Sterling had invited Maya Connor and me to a private dinner at his exclusive country club. It was the kind of place where the waiters look at you like you owe them an apology just for breathing their air. I wore my best tailored suit, but I knew exactly what Richard saw when he looked at me. He saw a tired old black man from South Chicago. He saw a retired mechanic who had spent his life under the hoods of broken cars. He saw an easy target. The dinner started with the usual fake smiles and hollow small talk. Richard boasted about his golf handicap and his corporate conquests while Connor sat there nodding like an obedient little lapdog. Maya looked beautiful, but she was visibly nervous, constantly reaching for Connor's hand under the table. I ate my meal in silence, watching the dynamics of the family my daughter was about to join. My instincts, sharpened by decades of surviving in a ruthless business world, told me that Richard had not invited me here just to share a meal. I was right. As soon as the plates were cleared, the friendly mask dropped. Richard reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, deliberate thud. Just a little administrative housekeeping before the big day, Richard announced, his voice dripping with false casualness. "It is a standard prenuptial agreement. Connor has a significant legacy to protect, as you can understand." I did not flinch. A prenup was expected. Maya was a successful architect, but the Sterlings liked to pretend they were royalty. However, Richard did not stop there. He pulled a second document from the envelope and slid it directly in front of me. "Now, Marcus." Richard continued, leaning forward and folding his hands. "Connor is launching a new investment venture next month, a very prestigious opportunity. But startups require liquid capital. We have been reviewing your financial situation, and we noticed you still hold the deed to that dilapidated little one-story house in South Chicago." I stared at the document. It was a transfer of deed. They had already filled out the paperwork. All it needed was my signature. "You live alone on a fixed pension, Marcus," Richard said, his tone thick with condescension. "That old shack is nothing but a tax burden to a man your age. It is a terrible neighborhood. You should sign the property over to Connor and Maya as a wedding gift. Connor can demolish it, sell the land for scrap, and use the pennies to help fund his new business. It is the least you can do to help them start their life." I looked down at the contract, and a cold, silent laugh echoed inside my mind. They really thought I was a senile fool. They had looked at a map, seen a rundown zip code, and made their arrogant assumptions. What Richard and his brilliant son did not know was the truth about that specific piece of land. That little house was the very first mechanic shop I ever owned. I had lived there for decades. But more importantly, what the Sterlings did not know was that the city council had just secretly approved a massive $200 million commercial redevelopment project for that exact block. Corporate developers had been calling my private numbers for a year, begging me to sell. That tiny patch of dirt they called a worthless shack was sitting right in the center of the new commercial district. It was worth an absolute fortune. Richard thought he was shaking down a poor old man for a few $1,000s, but he was actually trying to steal a gold mine. He was blinded by his own prejudice and greed. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my index finger on the document and pushed it slowly back across the mahogany table. "My property is not for sale, Richard," I said, my voice completely steady. "And it is certainly not a wedding gift for a grown man who should be perfectly capable of providing for himself." The temperature at the table dropped instantly. Richard's smug smile vanished, replaced by a hard, ugly scowl. His face turned a shade of pale red. He was a man who was not used to hearing the word no, especially not from someone he considered inferior. He leaned across the table, invading my space, his voice dropping to a low, threatening register. "Let us be realistic here, Marcus," Richard hissed. "The Sterling family has a reputation to uphold. Maya is a lovely girl, but let us face facts. She comes from nothing. She has no pedigree. If she wants to be welcomed into high society, if she wants to be a true Sterling, she needs to bring something of value to the table. A dowry." He locked his cold eyes onto mine. "If you refuse to sign this, your daughter will never truly have a place in our family. She will always be an outsider, a charity case. We will make sure she knows exactly how little her father cared about her future." The threat was naked and vile. He was explicitly telling me that he would make my daughter's life a living hell if I did not pay their extortion fee. I turned my gaze to Connor, fully expecting the young man to stand up for his future wife to tell his father that he was out of line. Instead, Connor just swirled the red wine in his glass and let out an annoyed sigh. "Come on, Marcus," Connor whined, sounding like a spoiled child denied a toy. "It is just a useless old house. Do not be so selfish. Maya and I need the money to build our brand. You do not want to ruin this for her, do you?" I looked at Maya. My strong, independent daughter was shrinking in her chair. She looked humiliated, her eyes welling up with tears. She whispered for Connor to stop, but she did not get up and walk away. She was too deeply manipulated, too blinded by her desperate desire to make this toxic relationship work. Right then and there, the picture became crystal clear. Connor was not a successful businessman. He was a parasite, and Richard was not a proud father. He was a predator trying to extract resources from a man he thought was weak. I slowly stood up from the table. I buttoned my suit jacket, looking down at the two men sitting before me. "I built my life with my own two hands," I said, making sure every word cut through the air. "I will never sign over my sweat and blood to fund your son's fragile ego. If you think Maya needs to buy her way into your family, then your family is completely bankrupt." I turned and walked out of the country club, leaving the contract sitting untouched on the table. Maya called after me, but I did not stop. I knew that trying to convince her right then would be useless. She had to see their true faces for herself. As I drove back to my home that night, the anger inside me settled into a cold, sharp focus. Richard had threatened my daughter. He had tried to rob me. He thought he had the upper hand because he believed his own delusions about who I was. He wanted to play a game of wealth and power, but he had absolutely no idea that he had just picked a fight with a ghost. I realized that simply saying no was not enough. Predators do not stop when you say no. They just look for another angle of attack. I needed to know exactly what kind of financial trouble Connor was hiding that made him so desperate for a piece of cheap land. I needed to dig into the Sterling Empire, and I knew exactly how to do it. The very next evening, a quiet, hesitant knock echoed through my heavy wooden front door. I knew exactly who it was before I even turned the handle. I opened the door to find Maya standing on my porch. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her usually perfect posture was completely defeated. She stepped into my modest living room surrounded by the faded floral wallpaper and the worn-out sofa she grew up on, and she immediately collapsed into my arms. She sobbed against my shoulder just like she did when she was a little girl with a scraped knee. I held her tight, letting her cry out the humiliation and the stress of the previous night. She apologized over and over for Richard's behavior at the country club. She told me she was so deeply ashamed of how her future father-in-law had spoken to me and that she had hardly slept a wink. But then, right on cue, the excuses started to pour out of her mouth. She wiped her tears and desperately tried to defend Connor. She said Connor was just under a massive amount of pressure right now. She told me his new business venture was stressing him out and that he was absolutely terrified of disappointing his wealthy, demanding father. She held my hands and promised me that Connor truly loved her and that things would be completely different once they were married and finally out of Richard's overbearing shadow. I listened to every single word, feeling a familiar heavy ache in my chest. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or tell her she was being naive. I just stroked her hair and told her that everything was going to be all right. I knew from decades of life experience that arguing with a woman blinded by toxic love was a battle you could never win with words alone. If I simply told her that Connor was a parasite, she would defend him and push me away. She had to see the ugly truth with her own eyes. She had to feel the cold, harsh reality of who Connor really was when his back was against the wall. I kissed her forehead, walked her out to her car, and watched her drive away back into the arms of the very family that wanted to consume her. As soon as her taillights faded into the dark Chicago night, my gentle, comforting demeanor vanished completely. I locked the front door and secured the deadbolt. I walked past the old kitchen table and the cheap linoleum floors that decorated my seemingly humble home. To the rest of the world, and even to my own daughter, this was just a tired old house belonging to a retired mechanic trying to survive on a fixed income. But the world only sees exactly what you allow it to see. I walked down the narrow back hallway and stopped in front of what everyone believed was a dusty storage closet filled with old car parts, rusty tools, and winter coats. I reached behind a heavy metal shelving unit and pressed my right thumb against a hidden state-of-the-art biometric scanner. A soft mechanical click echoed in the small space. The entire heavy shelving unit slid silently to the left on a concealed track, revealing a solid reinforced steel door. I stepped inside and the overhead LED lights flickered on automatically. The room was completely soundproof, climate-controlled, and dominated by a massive mahogany executive desk. 3 large high-definition computer monitors glowed to life, immediately illuminating a wall covered in complex financial blueprints, corporate trust structures, and global market analyses. This was the hidden nerve center of an empire that the arrogant Sterling family could not even begin to comprehend. I sat down in the heavy leather chair and looked at the single silver-framed photograph resting on my desk. It was a picture of my late wife, Sarah, holding a newborn Maya in her arms. 30 years ago, a ruthless illness took Sarah away from us far too soon. The endless hospital visits and aggressive medical bills had drained every single penny of our savings, leaving me a young, desperate widower with a baby girl and a completely broken heart. When Sarah passed, she left behind a very modest life insurance policy. Most men in my position would have used that small chunk of money to pay off the house mortgage, or maybe buy a reliable car. I did something else entirely. I took that insurance check, combined it with every dollar I had saved from fixing broken engines, and I bought a completely abandoned, dilapidated commercial warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. I spent my days working at the auto shop, smelling like motor oil just to put food on the table for Maya, and I spent my nights tearing down drywall, laying concrete, and rebuilding that warehouse with my own calloused, grease-stained hands. When the renovation was finally finished, I sold that building to a commercial developer for triple the price. I took that profit and I bought 2 more abandoned properties. Over 3 decades, I repeated that process over and over again. I quietly expanded my reach, buying up undervalued commercial real estate, funding massive development projects, and building a corporate ghost ship. I named it Blackwood Holdings. Today, Blackwood Holdings is an anonymous real estate and investment conglomerate worth tens of millions of dollars. I deliberately kept my name off every public registry, operating entirely through blind trusts and high-paid proxy lawyers. I kept living in my same old house in South Chicago. I drove my same old truck. I bought my clothes at the same discount stores. I did it because I had seen firsthand what sudden wealth does to good people. It breeds entitlement, attracts fake friends, and destroys ambition. I wanted Maya to grow up understanding the true value of hard work, humility, and genuine character. I wanted her to be loved for the brilliant woman she was, not targeted for the massive fortune her father owned. My working-class disguise was my greatest protection, and now as I stared at the glowing screens, I realized it was about to become my most devastating weapon. My fingers moved quickly and deliberately across the encrypted keyboard. Richard Sterling had practically threatened my daughter's entire future over a piece of land he arrogantly thought he could steal from a helpless old man. Connor had proven himself to be a spineless, calculating opportunist who would gladly throw his bride to the wolves to save his own skin. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial leverage, completely unaware that they were sitting at a poker table with the man who owned the entire casino. I opened a secure, untraceable communication channel and typed in a highly confidential web address. I was connecting directly with Elias Thorne. Elias was not a regular cheap private investigator who snapped photos of cheating spouses. He was a former federal forensic accountant who specialized in dismantling massive corporate fraud and tracking hidden offshore money for elite anonymous clients. He was ruthless, brilliant, and completely terrifying if he was looking into your life. His services cost an absolute fortune, and he was worth every single penny I paid him. The encrypted video call connected, and Elias appeared on the screen, his sharp face illuminated by his own massive bank of surveillance monitors. I did not waste any time with polite pleasantries or small talk. I gave him a simple, chilling directive. I told him I needed a complete microscopic dissection of the entire Sterling family network. I wanted to know absolutely everything about Richard Sterling's luxury construction company. I wanted to see their real quarterly losses, their hidden corporate debts, their questionable tax loopholes, and their desperate financial leverage. I needed to know who they owed money to and exactly how close they were to the edge of the cliff. But more importantly, I told Elias to dig deep into the golden boy Connor Sterling. I wanted every bank statement, every hidden credit card, every deleted text message, and every dirty secret he was keeping from my daughter. I wanted to know exactly why a young man who claimed to be a highly successful investment director was suddenly so desperate to bully an old man out of a cheap piece of property in a bad neighborhood. I wanted to find the rotting cracks in their perfect upper-class white picket fence. Elias did not ask any unnecessary questions. He simply nodded slowly, his eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of a massive new hunt, and promised me a preliminary damage report within 48 hours. I ended the call and leaned back in my heavy leather chair, staring at the complex financial data scrolling across my monitors. The Sterling family thought they were dealing with a poor, uneducated man who did not understand how the modern world worked. They thought their expensive tailored suits and exclusive country club memberships made them invincible gods among men. They were about to learn a very painful, permanent lesson. Wealth does not make you bulletproof when your foundation is built on lies. And when you decide to insult, threaten, and manipulate a man's only daughter, you better be absolutely certain you know exactly who you are picking a fight with. The trap was officially set, the shadows were moving into place, and the relentless countdown to their absolute destruction had just begun. 48 hours. That was all it took for Elias Thorne to peel back the pristine upper-class skin of the Sterling family and expose the rotting sickness hiding underneath. I sat in my secure soundproof office, the hum of the servers the only sound in the room, watching the encrypted file decrypt on my main monitor. The progress bar hit 100% and a massive folder opened before my eyes. I had asked Elias to find the cracks in their perfect white picket fence. What he delivered was not a crack, it was a completely shattered foundation. I opened the primary dossier on Connor Sterling. He carried himself like a master of the universe, always wearing those tailored Italian suits and bragging about his position as a senior investment director at a prestigious wealth management firm. He treated my daughter like she was lucky to even be in his presence. But the employment records glowing on my screen told a completely different story. Connor had not managed a single dime in half a year. He was not an investment director. He was currently unemployed. He had been quietly terminated 6 months ago for gross negligence and unauthorized use of company funds. For 6 long months, this coward had been putting on a suit every single morning, kissing my daughter goodbye and pretending to go to a high-powered corporate job. He spent his days sitting in upscale coffee shops, playing the part of a successful businessman while living entirely off the illusions he created. He was an absolute fraud, a hollow shell of a man playing dress-up. But unemployment was just the tip of the iceberg. Being a liar is one thing. Being a desperate, dangerous criminal is another. I scrolled down to the financial analysis Elias had compiled. He had dug deep into Connor's off-the-book transactions, tracing wire transfers and hidden accounts that standard background checks would never catch. The numbers flashing across my screen made my blood run absolutely cold. Connor was not just living beyond his means. He was a drowning, desperate gambling addict. He owed $500,000 in underground sports betting. And he did not owe this massive debt to a legitimate bank or a polite credit agency. He owed it to a violent underground syndicate that operated in the shadows of the city. These were men who did not send polite collection letters or negotiate payment plans. They sent broken bones. They sent threats in the middle of the night. This was exactly why Richard and Connor were so incredibly desperate to steal my land at the country club dinner. They needed a massive, untraceable influx of cash to save Connor from the violent consequences of his own pathetic actions. They looked at my property not as a wedding gift but as a ransom payment to keep the wolves away from their door. I thought my anger had reached its absolute peak, but then I clicked on the final subfolder. Elias had flagged it with a high-priority warning and attached an urgent audio note. I clicked play, listening to the private investigator's grim voice echoing in the quiet room. Elias told me to look closely at the offshore loan applications Connor had submitted over the last 90 days. I opened the attached PDF files, my hands trembling with a quiet, lethal rage. Connor had applied for multiple high-interest predatory loans from unregulated online lenders. He was trying to scrape together enough cash to keep the syndicate off his back. But he did not use his own name. His credit score was completely destroyed, and no legitimate institution would ever lend him a single dollar. Instead, he used a pristine, spotless credit history to secure the funds. I zoomed in on the signature line of the digital loan applications. My breathing completely stopped. The screen blurred for a second as a wave of pure, violent fury washed over me. He had used my daughter's name. He had stolen Maya's social security number. This man, the man who was supposed to stand at an altar in a few days and promise before God to protect and cherish my daughter, was actively destroying her financial life behind her back. He was forging her signature to secure dirty money. He was shackling my beautiful, hard-working daughter to $500,000 of violent underground debt. If he defaulted, and it was only a matter of time before he did, those criminals would not just come after him. They would come after Maya. They would ruin her credit, destroy her architectural firm, and put her physical safety in extreme jeopardy. He was using the woman he claimed to love as a human shield to protect his own cowardly skin. Every instinct in my body, the deep, primal instinct of a father from the south side of Chicago, screamed at me to act immediately. I wanted to get into my truck, drive straight to Connor's luxury apartment, kick the door off its hinges, and break every single bone in his hands so he could never forge my daughter's name ever again. I wanted to drag him out into the street by his collar and expose him to the entire world right then and there. I wanted to show Maya the documents and pull her out of that toxic relationship immediately. I stood up from my heavy leather chair, my chest heaving, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white. I paced the length of the secure room, staring at the photograph of my late wife, Sarah. I remembered the promise I made to her on her deathbed. I promised her I would always protect our little girl. I promised no one would ever take advantage of her. But I am not just a protective father. I am a man who spent 30 years building an invisible corporate empire. I am a man who understands leverage, timing, and absolute destruction. I knew that a quick emotional revenge was a cheap revenge. If I went to Maya right now, Connor would cry. He would beg. He would manipulate her empathetic heart, claiming it was a mistake, a temporary lapse in judgment due to stress. Richard Sterling would immediately hire expensive public relations firms and high-powered defense attorneys. They would pay off the debts, quietly bury the evidence, and spin the narrative. They would survive. And worse, they would paint me as the crazy, jealous father trying to ruin his daughter's happiness. I did not want the Sterling family to survive this. I wanted to eradicate them. I walked back to my desk, picked up my encrypted phone, and dialed a number I only used for corporate emergencies. My lead attorney, a brilliant and utterly ruthless man named David, answered on the very first ring. "David," I said, my voice eerily calm, suppressing the hurricane of rage inside my chest. "I am sending you a secure data packet. It contains undeniable proof of federal wire fraud and felony identity theft. The perpetrator is Connor Sterling." There was a brief silence on the line as David processed the name. "Marcus," he replied, his tone entirely professional. "Identity theft is a severe federal offense, especially with the amounts you are implying. Do you want me to contact the authorities and have a warrant issued for his arrest tonight? We can have him in handcuffs before morning." I looked back at the monitors. I looked at the fake loan applications bearing my daughter's stolen identity. I thought about Richard Sterling looking down his nose at me, threatening to make Maya an outcast if I did not hand over my property. "No," I told my lawyer. "Do not call the police yet. Do not file a single piece of paperwork with the authorities. Keep this completely sealed under attorney-client privilege." Marcus, David cautioned, his voice laced with concern. "If this man is actively using your daughter's social security number for fraudulent loans every day, you wait, puts her at greater financial risk. Why are we delaying?" "Because we are going to let the wedding happen." I stated the words carrying a cold, heavy finality. I could hear David breathe in sharply on the other end of the line. "You want to let your daughter walk down the aisle with a man you know is a criminal." "I am going to let them think they have won," I explained, my eyes fixed on the glowing screens. "The Sterling family thrives on public image. They feed on their reputation. If we arrest him quietly in the middle of the night, they will sweep it under the rug. I want to catch the entire Sterling nest at their absolute highest point. I want them dressed in their finest clothes, surrounded by all their wealthy, arrogant friends, believing they are completely untouchable." I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. I want them standing at the very peak of their false superiority. Because when I finally kick the pedestal out from under them, I want to make sure they fall the hardest. I want the destruction of their legacy to be so absolute, so public, and so devastating that the name Sterling becomes a warning label in this city. Understood, David replied, catching the lethal determination in my voice. I will prepare the legal traps and have everything ready to deploy on your exact command. I ended the call and set the phone down. The trap was no longer just a concept. It was a living, breathing mechanism waiting to snap shut. Connor and Richard thought they were playing a game of intimidation with a poor old man. They had no idea they had just walked willingly into a financial slaughterhouse. I turned off the monitors, plunging the room into darkness, perfectly content to wait in the shadows until the day of the wedding. I had already exposed the son as a pathetic gambling fraud who hid behind my daughter's name. But Connor was just a symptom of the disease. The real infection was his father, Richard Sterling. A man does not learn to be that arrogant, that entitled, and that financially reckless in a vacuum. He learns it by watching the man at the head of the table. Richard had sat across from me at the country club sipping a vintage wine and tried to extort an old mechanic out of a piece of land to fund his family's legacy. It was time to see exactly what that legacy was actually made of. I sat back down in the glow of my secure monitors and directed my focus entirely on Sterling Construction. To the public eye, Richard's company was a titan of luxury real estate development. They built sleek, glass-paneled condominiums for the ultra-rich. They sponsored charity galas and had their gold-lettered logo plastered on construction cranes all over the downtown skyline. But as I pulled up the forensic accounting data Elias Thorne had provided, the glittering facade began to rust and peel away right before my eyes. The deeper I dug into the ledgers, the more pathetic the reality became. Richard Sterling was not a titan of industry. He was a desperate man juggling flaming torches on a sinking ship. His company was bleeding cash. Profit margins on their last 3 luxury developments had evaporated due to catastrophic mismanagement and supply chain failures. They were dodging calls from furious subcontractors. They were shifting money from new investor deposits just to pay the interest on their older, crushing debts. It was a classic high society Ponzi scheme wrapped in tailored suits and expensive public relations campaigns. Richard was projecting absolute wealth and superiority to the world while secretly suffocating under the weight of his own financial incompetence. But there was one specific vulnerability that caught my attention. One massive glowing red flag flashing on my screen. Sterling Construction had a catastrophic balloon payment rapidly approaching. $5 million in institutional debt was set to mature in less than 2 weeks. If Richard could not pay it or successfully refinance it, his entire company would instantly fall into corporate receivership. His assets would be frozen, his project sites would be locked down, and his precious reputation would be dragged through the mud on the front page of every financial newspaper in the city. I pulled up the loan origination documents to see which financial institution had the misfortune of lending $5 million to a sinking ship. The screen loaded, displaying the header of a highly secretive, aggressive private equity firm known as Vanguard Apex Capital. I stopped. I leaned closer to the monitor. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that only comes when you realize the universe has handed you the exact weapon you need, fully loaded and ready to fire. Vanguard Apex Capital was not just some random Wall Street hedge fund. It was an umbrella subsidiary, a shadow corporation. And the parent company that owned Vanguard Apex Capital entirely was Blackwood Holdings, my company. I was Richard Sterling's lender. I was the man holding the $5 million note. The arrogant aristocrat who had tried to bully me out of my small home to save his legacy was secretly begging my corporation for a financial lifeline. I accessed the internal communications logs between Sterling Construction and my fund managers. Richard had been sending frantic, borderline begging emails for the past 3 weeks. He was pleading for a 12-month extension on the loan. He promised new collateral. He promised upcoming profits from projects that were barely off the ground. He was sweating terrified, watching the clock tick down to his absolute ruin. He needed that extension signed before the wedding, or the entire Sterling empire would collapse while he was standing at the altar giving his arrogant father of the groom speech. I picked up my secure phone and dialed the direct line of my lead fund manager at Vanguard Apex. His name was Arthur, a sharp, unyielding financial shark who managed my most aggressive portfolios. He answered immediately, "Mr. Blackwood." Arthur said, his voice crisp and professional. What can I do for you tonight? Arthur, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. Tell me about the Sterling construction account, the $5 million note that is maturing. Arthur let out a cynical sigh. It is a toxic asset, sir. Richard Sterling is completely overleveraged. His company is a hollow shell running on fumes. He has been begging us for an extension all week, but my recommendation is a hard denial. We should reject the extension call in the debt and foreclose on his remaining properties. If we squeeze him now, we can liquidate his commercial assets and easily recoup our investment. He is done. Arthur was right. From a strictly logical financial perspective, putting a bullet in Sterling construction right now was the smart move. But this was no longer just business. This was profoundly, intensely personal. No, Arthur. I replied, my voice echoing coldly in the soundproof room. I want you to approve the extension. Give him exactly what he wants. Give him the full 12 months. There was a pause on the line. Arthur was confused, but he knew better than to question my judgment. Understood, sir. I will draft the approval and have the terms sent over to his lawyers tomorrow morning. Wait, I interrupted. There is a specific condition. I want you to structure the new agreement, but I want you to embed a highly aggressive, non-negotiable morality clause directly into the core covenants of the contract. A morality clause is a standard piece of legal architecture usually buried deep in the fine print of corporate contracts. It simply states that if the borrower engages in any behavior that brings public scandal, criminal association, or severe ethical disrepute to themselves or the lending institution, the lender has the right to take punitive action. But I did not want a standard clause. I wanted a loaded gun. I want the clause written so tightly that there is absolutely no room for interpretation, I instructed. If Richard Sterling, or any immediate member of the Sterling executive family, is involved in public humiliation, fraud, criminal investigations, or severe ethical misconduct, the extension is instantly null and void. And Arthur listened to me very carefully. If that clause is triggered, the $5 million becomes due immediately. No grace period, no 30-day warning, no negotiation, immediate total recall of the entire debt. Arthur chuckled, catching on to the lethal nature of the strategy. It is an instant death penalty clause, sir. He is so desperate for the cash flow he will sign it without even reading the fine print. He will just be relieved to get the extension. Exactly, I said. Have the paperwork finalized and signed by Friday. I want him walking into the weekend feeling like he just conquered the world. I hung up the phone and looked back at the glowing screens. The pieces were no longer just moving into place. They were locked, armed, and ready to detonate. Richard Sterling was going to wake up tomorrow morning and receive the best news of his life. He was going to see that his loan extension was miraculously approved. He was going to put on his expensive tuxedo, drink his expensive champagne, and strut into his son's wedding believing he was an untouchable king. He would look at me, the quiet, retired black mechanic sitting in the back of the room, and he would feel absolutely superior. He would have no idea that the ink on his new contract was actually a death warrant. He would have no idea that the exact moment he decided to publicly humiliate me, the exact moment his criminal son was exposed to the authorities, that morality clause would snap shut like a steel bear trap around his neck. I had placed a razor-sharp guillotine directly over Richard's head, and the best part was when the blade finally dropped, he would be the one pulling the lever. The morning of the wedding arrived with a suffocating layer of tension. The Grand Monarch was not just a venue. It was a massive, intimidating statement of wealth and power. Marble columns reached up to painted ceilings, cascading floral arrangements cost more than a luxury car, and an army of staff moved through the halls like invisible clockwork. I wore a tailored black tuxedo, standing quietly near the grand staircase, watching the Sterling family parade around the lobby like royalty holding court. Richard was in his element, barking sharp orders at the frantic wedding planners and aggressively shaking hands with early arrivals. I remained perfectly still, a silent observer in a sea of white elitism, holding the detonator to their entire world in my pocket. The official photographer clapped his hands and called for the immediate family portraits. Maya was upstairs in the bridal suite with her bridesmaids, so it was just the groom and the parents for this particular session. I walked toward the ornate staging area, stepping onto the plush red carpet, ready to take my place beside the man who was about to marry my daughter. But before the flashes could even go off, Richard stepped directly into my path. He did not ask me to move. He did not politely excuse himself. He placed a heavy, aggressive hand on my shoulder and physically guided me away from the bright lights and the cameras. We are doing the Sterling legacy shots first, Richard muttered, his grip tightening on my jacket as he pushed me toward the shadows. You do not fit the aesthetic of this particular spread. Wait in the back until we need you. He did not just point to a chair in the lobby. He forcefully shoved me through a heavy wooden door tucked behind the main staircase. It was a cramped, dimly lit staging room meant for the catering staff. Stacks of folded metal chairs, empty bus tubs smelling of old wine, and the sharp scent of industrial cleaner surrounded me. The message was loud and clear. To Richard Sterling, I was not the father of the bride. I was the help. I was the dirt he wanted swept under the rug before his wealthy friends arrived. I stood in that small, humiliating room, straightening my jacket completely undisturbed. They were digging the hole deeper with every single breath they took. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden door clicked open. It was not Richard coming to fetch me for a photograph. It was Connor, the golden boy. He stepped into the dusty, cramped room and firmly locked the door behind him. He looked impeccable in his custom-fitted tuxedo, but his eyes were bloodshot, darting around the small space with the frantic, terrified energy of a cornered rat. The smell of expensive cologne could not hide the faint, sour stench of stale alcohol sweating out of his pores. His massive gambling debt was clearly suffocating him, crushing his chest on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. He did not say hello. He did not call me Dad or even Marcus. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, slamming it down onto a stacked catering table right in front of me. "Sign it," Connor demanded, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of absolute fear and blinding arrogance. I looked down. It was a full legal power of attorney document granting Connor absolute control over the sale of my house in South Chicago. He had bypassed the prenuptial agreement entirely and escalated straight to raw extortion. He needed that land to pay off the underground syndicate, and he needed it today. "I told your father my answer at the country club," I said calmly, my voice steady in the quiet room. "My property is not yours to sell." Connor took a step closer, invading my personal space, trying to physically intimidate a man who grew up fighting for survival on the south side of Chicago. "You do not have a choice anymore, old man." Connor spat his mask of the perfect gentleman, completely dissolving into a pathetic sneer. "My friends are out there, the mayor is out there. 600 of the most powerful people in this city are sitting in that ballroom right now waiting for a wedding. If you do not put your pen on that paper this exact second, I will walk out that door, grab a microphone, and call off the entire wedding." I stared at him, letting his vile words hang in the stagnant air. He was using my daughter's heart as leverage. "I will tell everyone she cheated on me," Connor hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous, desperate whisper. "I will absolutely destroy her reputation in front of every elite family in this state. She will be crying on the floor in her white dress, completely humiliated, and it will be entirely your fault. Sign the paper. Give me the house and your daughter gets her fairy tale. Refuse and I will shatter her world before the appetizers are even served." It was the most despicable, cowardly act of desperation I had ever witnessed in my 74 years of life. He was willing to publicly destroy the woman he supposedly loved just to pay off the violent criminals breathing down his neck. He thought he had me backed into a corner. He thought my love for Maya would force me to surrender my assets to protect her from public embarrassment. He was banking on my paternal instinct overriding my logic. But Connor was playing a cheap game of checkers, and I was playing a game of chess that he could not even begin to comprehend. I looked at his sweaty, panicked face. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of disgust, but I did not show it. Instead, I let out a slow, defeated sigh, perfectly playing the part of a broken, terrified father who had just been bested by a superior opponent. I reached into the inside pocket of my tuxedo. I did not pull out my phone to call for help. I pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. Connor's eyes lit up with predatory triumph. He thought he had won. I leaned over the catering table, uncapped the pen, and placed the tip on the signature line. I signed the document. But I did not write Marcus Blackwood. I did not even write the version of my name that was on my public driver license. I used a highly specific, legally void signature that my corporate lawyers and I had designed years ago for dealing with fraudulent contracts. To the untrained eye, it looked like a messy, rushed signature of an old man under immense pressure. In a court of law, it was about as legally binding as a drawing of a stick figure. It meant absolutely nothing. I tossed the pen beside the paper. Connor eagerly snatched the document off the table, inspecting the ink with greedy, desperate eyes. He folded it quickly and shoved it into his pocket, letting out a breath he had clearly been holding for days. "Good boy." Connor sneered, his arrogance completely restored now that he thought his life was saved. "Now stay in here and keep quiet until someone comes to get you. Try not to ruin the pictures." He turned around, unlocked the door, and walked out of the cramped room, practically skipping down the hallway with his stolen prize. He thought he had just secured his salvation. He thought he had outsmarted a foolish old man. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the dim light once again. I stood there in the silence. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel defeated. I slowly reached into my other pocket and pulled out the small, highly sensitive digital audio recorder I had activated the moment Richard shoved me into this room. I pressed the stop button. The tiny red light blinked off. I had him. I had the entire extortion attempt, the threats against Maya, and his vile manipulation recorded in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. It was the final nail in his coffin. Connor thought he had just extorted a house from a helpless mechanic. He had no idea he had just handed a loaded weapon to his own executioner. The trap was now fully armed, and all I had to do was walk out to the main ballroom and wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. I waited 5 minutes after Connor left the cramped catering closet before I stepped back out into the grand hallway. The heavy double doors of the main ballroom were closed, guarded by tall ushers wearing pristine white gloves. Inside the hall, I could hear the string quartet tuning their instruments, the soft hum of the cello vibrating through the floorboards. This was the moment every father dreams of, from the second he holds his little girl in his arms, walking her down the aisle, giving her away. I smoothed the lapels of my tuxedo, took a deep breath to center myself, and made my way toward the bridal staging area where I was supposed to meet Maya. Before I could even catch a glimpse of the white train of her dress, a wall of tailored gray suits blocked my path. It was Richard. He was accompanied by a tall, silver-haired white man I had never seen before in my life. Richard stepped forward, his face an absolute mask of false, aristocratic politeness, but his eyes were gleaming with that same predatory arrogance I had seen at the country club. He held up his hand to stop me and said there had been a slight change in the choreography. He introduced the stranger next to him as Connor's Uncle Preston. Richard looked me up and down and stated that they had decided it would be much better for the visual symmetry of the procession if Preston walked Maya down the aisle instead of me. He had the nerve to stand right in my face and tell me that the height difference and the color coordination with the groomsmen just made for a much cleaner aesthetic for the society magazines. Cleaner aesthetic. Visual symmetry. He was literally whitewashing my own daughter's wedding walk because he did not want a dark-skinned, retired mechanic ruining the perfect, wealthy, white illusion he had built for his high society friends. I looked at Preston, who offered a weak, pathetic little smile but did not step aside. I felt the heat rising in my chest. I demanded to speak to Maya immediately. I knew my daughter would never agree to this, but Richard just shook his head smoothly. He told me Maya already knew about the change. He explained that they had taken her phone away that morning, calling it standard bridal protocol, so she could be completely present and free of distractions. Richard leaned in close and whispered that they had told Maya my bad knee was acting up and that I had personally requested to avoid the pressure of the spotlight. He said she completely understood and just wanted me to relax and enjoy the ceremony from the audience. They had isolated her. They had cut off her communication and fed her a lie wrapped in fake concern for my health. I could have caused a massive scene right there in the hallway. I could have shouted, pushed past their wall of gray suits, and ruined the entire procession before it even began. Every fatherly instinct in my body screamed at me to tear the doors open and get my daughter. But then I felt the weight of the digital audio recorder burning a hole in my pocket. I remembered the fraudulent loan applications with my daughter's stolen social security number. I remembered the $5 million financial guillotine currently hanging by a thread directly over Richard's neck. A temporary humiliation in this hallway was the necessary price for absolute irreversible victory. If I blew up now, they would cancel the wedding, spin the story, and escape the financial trap. I had to let them walk willingly onto the executioner's block. I gave Richard a slow, measured nod. I did not argue. I simply told him to make sure she did not trip on her train. Richard's smug, victorious grin returned in full force. He thought he had completely broken my spirit. He snapped his fingers and pointed toward a young usher, instructing the boy to show me to my assigned seat. The usher did not lead me down the central aisle to the front row where the parents of the bride belong. He led me around the outer perimeter of the massive ballroom, keeping me strictly in the shadows. We walked past the towering floral centerpieces, past the tables filled with city councilmen, real estate tycoons, and corporate executives who clinked their champagne glasses and laughed. We kept walking until the tables stopped having silk tablecloths and crystal centerpieces. The usher stopped at table 45. It was pushed entirely out of the main sightlines, tucked violently into a dark, drafty corner, right between the swinging doors of the catering kitchen and the main hallway leading to the public restrooms. The smell of expensive perfume and fresh lilies faded completely here, replaced by the heavy scent of industrial dish soap, roasted garlic, and the constant whoosh of waiters rushing in and out of the kitchen doors. Seated at the table were the venue lighting technicians, the backup audio crew, and a few off-duty valets. They were wearing black polo shirts with radio earpieces. They looked up at me, an older black man in a formal tuxedo with a mixture of utter confusion and profound silent pity. The father of the bride had literally been banished to sit with the hired help next to the bathrooms. I did not complain. I pulled out my chair and sat down facing the distant, brightly lit altar. The music swelled through the massive speakers. The heavy mahogany doors at the front of the room opened and the entire room stood up. From my distant shadowed corner, peering through the narrow gaps between the guests and the towering ice sculptures, I saw my beautiful Maya. She looked like an absolute angel glowing in her white gown, but my heart cracked down the middle when I saw Uncle Preston proudly offering her his arm. I saw the brief, panicked confusion in Maya's eyes. I watched her look down the long aisle, desperately searching the front rows for my face. When she could not find me among the sea of wealthy white strangers, her shoulders dropped just a fraction of an inch. She swallowed hard, forced a brave, trembling smile, and took Preston's arm. She believed I had abandoned her out of stage fright. She believed I was hiding. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly. Connor stood at the altar and said his vows with the earnest, loving face of a saint, knowing perfectly well he had just extorted a house from me in a storage closet 20 minutes prior. Richard sat in the very front row, puffing his chest out like a conquering emperor looking over his newly acquired kingdom. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife and the applause erupted through the hall, the waiters immediately began flooding out of the kitchen doors right behind my head, carrying trays of expensive food. I sat quietly at table 45. The audio-visual crew tried to make polite conversation, awkwardly asking how I knew the bride and groom. I just smiled a gentle grandfatherly smile and told them I was a very close silent investor in the family business. A waiter dropped a plate of dry, overcooked chicken in front of me. The rich guests up front were dining on filet mignon and lobster tail, but this was the vendor meal. I did not cause a fuss. I picked up my silver fork and knife, cut a piece of the dry meat, and ate my meal with the calm, methodical precision of a man who knows exactly how the movie is going to end. I reached into the inside pocket of my tuxedo jacket, feeling the cold metal of the audio recorder that held Connor's entire criminal confession. I felt the heavy weight of my encrypted phone, where David and my team of corporate lawyers were waiting in total silence for my single command. I pulled back the cuff of my jacket and looked down at my watch. The gold hands moved with quiet, relentless certainty. 2 hours. In exactly 2 hours, the dinner service would end and the toasts would begin. In 2 hours, Richard Sterling would take the main stage under the bright spotlights to brag about his wealth, his legacy, and his absolute superiority. In 2 hours, the steel trap I had spent 3 grueling months building would finally snap shut on their necks. I took a slow sip of my ice water, leaned back in my uncomfortable banquet chair, and watched the Sterling family dance, laugh, and celebrate their own absolute destruction. The dinner plates were finally cleared by the army of silent waiters moving through the ballroom. The atmosphere in the Grand Monarch shifted from formal dining to drunken revelry. The string quartet was replaced by a high-energy live band playing loud music. The champagne flowed like a river, and the massive dance floor quickly filled with wealthy guests laughing and swaying under the bright crystal chandeliers. I remained in my isolated seat at table 45, tucked away next to the kitchen doors, entirely forgotten by the people celebrating my own daughter's wedding. But I was not there to celebrate. I was there to hunt. My eyes never left the head table. Maya was glowing, chatting happily with her bridesmaids, completely oblivious to the venomous snake she had just married. But Connor was not celebrating at all. He was sitting stiffly in his chair, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He kept pulling his phone out of his tuxedo pocket, staring at the glowing screen and swallowing hard. His leg was bouncing up and down with a frantic, nervous energy. Whatever messages he was receiving, they were not congratulations from old friends. The underground syndicate he owed $500,000 to did not care that it was his wedding day. They wanted their money, and they were clearly tired of waiting. Suddenly, Connor slammed his phone face down on the table. He whispered a hurried excuse to Maya, forced a brief and entirely unconvincing smile, and practically sprinted away from the main stage. He did not head toward the crowded lobby or the busy public restrooms. He moved quickly toward the heavy velvet curtains that concealed the private VIP corridors of the venue. I stood up from my chair immediately. The lighting technician sitting next to me barely noticed my departure. I blended into the dark shadows of the room, walking with the quiet, deliberate steps of a man who had spent 30 years navigating the treacherous waters of commercial real estate. I slipped behind the velvet curtains just a few seconds after Connor. The transition from the deafening noise of the ballroom to the suffocating silence of the private corridor was absolute. The walls here were lined with thick acoustic paneling. It was a labyrinth of empty hallways meant for the hotel executives and high-tier security staff. I moved like a ghost, keeping my distance, watching the back of his expensive tuxedo disappear around a corner. I could hear his heavy, panicked breathing echoing off the walls. He was moving like a prey animal trying to escape a predator, completely unaware that the real predator was walking silently right behind him. I stopped just short of the intersection, pressing my back flat against the cool wallpaper. From around the corner, I heard the frantic dialing of a cell phone, followed by the pacing of expensive leather shoes on the thick carpet. Connor had backed himself into a dead-end hallway, completely isolated from the wedding, his new bride, and his arrogant father. He put the phone to his ear and his voice began to tremble uncontrollably. "Listen to me," Connor pleaded, his tone stripped of every single ounce of the elite arrogance he usually carried. "I told you I just need 24 more hours. You do not have to send anyone to my house. I swear to you the money is secured." There was a long, heavy pause as the person on the other end spoke. I could not hear the voice of the loan shark, but I could hear the absolute terror it instilled in my new son-in-law. Connor grabbed his own hair, pacing frantically back and forth in the narrow space. "No, leave my wife out of this," Connor begged, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "Maya does not know anything about the loans. She has no idea I used her social security number. If you contact her, the entire deal falls apart and nobody gets paid. You have to give me until tomorrow morning. I just secured the asset today. I finally got it." He paused again, his breathing ragged. He was negotiating for his physical safety, trying to appease violent men who would not hesitate to break his legs or worse. And then he played his final card. He played the card he thought he had stolen from me in that dusty catering closet just an hour ago. "I have the deed," Connor insisted, his voice rising in a pathetic attempt to sound confident. "I forced the old black man to sign over the power of attorney an hour ago. He is a terrified, broken old mechanic. He did not even put up a fight. His piece of land in South Chicago is right in the middle of a massive new commercial development zone. It is worth millions. I can liquidate it through a shadow broker by tomorrow afternoon. That old black man's land is more than enough to pay you back with full interest. Just call off your guys and give me one more day." The absolute sheer audacity of his words hung in the empty corridor like a toxic gas. He had just confessed to absolutely everything out loud. He admitted to stealing Maya's identity. He admitted to hiding his massive underground gambling debts from his new wife. He admitted to extorting what he believed was a poor, defenseless black man. And he proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that his entire relationship with my daughter was nothing but a calculated, predatory financial transaction designed to save his own pathetic life. I did not feel anger. Anger is a loud, messy emotion that clouds your judgment and forces you into making reckless mistakes. What I felt was a cold, absolute, and total clarity. The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked perfectly into place. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit. I did not pull out the audio recorder this time. I pulled out my secure, high-definition smartphone. I activated the video camera, making sure the resolution was set to the absolute maximum. I slowly leaned the lens of the camera just past the edge of the corner, keeping my body entirely hidden in the deep shadows. On the screen, Connor Sterling was perfectly framed. He was leaning against the wall, sweating profusely, begging the criminals on the phone to spare him. The elegant lighting in the corridor illuminated his terrified face with absolute perfection. I recorded every single second of his pathetic groveling. I captured the exact moment he promised to sell my property to save himself. I captured the exact moment he admitted my daughter was completely innocent and unaware of the massive fraud he had committed in her name. Connor thanked the men on the phone profusely, letting out a massive sigh of relief as they apparently agreed to his 24-hour extension. He hung up the phone, leaned his head back against the wall, and closed his eyes. He thought he had bought himself another day. He thought he had successfully navigated his way out of a death sentence. I silently stopped the video recording and saved the file directly to my secure encrypted cloud server. I instantly forwarded the video clip to David, my lead attorney, with a single text message attached to the file. The message simply read, "The final nail." Connor took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He put his phone back into his pocket and plastered that fake, arrogant smile back onto his face. He prepared to walk back out into the ballroom and play the role of the perfect, wealthy groom. He walked right past the corner where I was standing, completely blind to my presence, hidden in the darkness. I watched him disappear back through the heavy velvet curtains, heading toward the bright lights and the loud music. He was walking back to my daughter. He was walking back to his arrogant father. They were all gathering around the main stage, preparing to raise their glasses and toast to their fake legacy and their stolen wealth. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and followed him at a slow, measured pace. The game was no longer being played. The game was officially over. Connor Sterling had just written and signed his own digital confession, and I held the only copy in existence. His fate was sealed in stone. The financial guillotine I had built over the last 3 months was fully loaded, locked, and armed. I stepped back out into the grand ballroom. The music was dying down, and the master of ceremonies was tapping a microphone, asking the 600 elite guests to take their seats for the family toasts. I walked past the wealthy politicians and the corporate titans, ignoring their confused glances, as I made my way back to table 45. Richard Sterling was already walking up the steps to the main stage, holding a crystal glass of champagne. He looked out over the massive crowd with the pride of a conquering king. He did not know that his company was secretly bankrupt. He did not know his son was facing federal prison for identity theft. He did not know the power of attorney contract in his son's pocket was entirely fake. I sat down in my chair next to the kitchen doors, picked up my glass of ice water, and waited for Richard to start speaking. The absolute destruction of the Sterling family was exactly 5 minutes away. The sharp clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne glass echoed through the massive ballroom of the Grand Monarch. The loud music from the live band faded into silence, and 600 of the wealthiest people in the city took their seats. The low murmur of the elite crowd died down as Richard Sterling confidently climbed the carpeted steps to the main stage. He stood behind the grand acrylic podium, adjusting his silk tie and looking out over the sea of wealthy faces with the arrogant pride of a feudal lord surveying his kingdom. I sat completely still in the dark corner at table 45, watching the man who had just tried to extort me prepare to address the crowd. Richard cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. His voice boomed across the ballroom, smooth, practiced, and dripping with an unbearable sense of superiority. Family, friends, and distinguished guests, Richard began raising his glass of expensive champagne. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the continuation of a great legacy. The Sterling name has always stood for excellence, for tradition, and for building a better future. And my son Connor has always embodied the very best of what this family represents. He is a man of vision, a man of status, and above all, a man of immense generosity. Richard paused, letting his wealthy friends chuckle and nod in agreement. Then his eyes shifted toward Maya, who was sitting next to Connor at the head table. Richard's smile shifted from proud to thinly veiled condescension. When Connor first told me he was going to marry Maya, I will admit I was surprised. Richard continued, his tone taking on the fake, sickly sweet cadence of a politician. Maya is a beautiful girl, but she comes from a very different world than we do. She grew up in the harsh reality of South Chicago. She was raised by a single father, a mechanic in a neighborhood where simply surviving is an achievement. She did not grow up with the pedigrees, the country clubs, or the advantages that we consider standard. The ballroom fell uncomfortably silent. A few guests shifted in their seats. Maya looked down at her lap, her face flushing with deep embarrassment. Connor did not reach out to hold her hand. He just sat there, smiling blankly at the crowd, letting his father publicly strip away my daughter's dignity. But that is the true measure of my son Richard, declared, his voice rising in dramatic triumph. Connor did not care about her lack of background. He did not care that she came to us with nothing. Connor saw a diamond in the rough, and he chose to pull her out of the darkness and bring her into the light. He is giving her a life she could never have dreamed of in her old neighborhood. He is giving her the Sterling name. So please raise your glasses to my son, a man who proves that true nobility is about rescuing those less fortunate and elevating them to our level. A wave of applause erupted from the front tables. The politicians, the real estate developers, and the high society wives clapped their hands, celebrating what they believed was the ultimate act of upper-class charity. They were clapping for the arrogant fantasy that my brilliant, hardworking daughter was nothing but a stray dog that the great Connor Sterling had graciously adopted. I felt the blood rushing in my ears. I felt the absolute raw fury of a father who had spent his entire life protecting his child from exactly this kind of poison. I did not care about my grand plan for a few seconds. I did not care about the financial traps or the offshore accounts. I cared about the tears welling up in Maya's eyes. I pushed my chair back. The metal legs scraped loudly against the marble floor. I stood up from the shadows of the catering corner. I buttoned my tuxedo jacket and I began to walk. I walked past the lighting technicians who stared at me with wide eyes. I walked down the long, wide aisle that separated the massive banquet tables. Hundreds of heads began to turn. The applause slowly died out like a suffocated flame. The sea of wealthy white faces watched in absolute confusion as a 74-year-old black man marched with heavy, deliberate steps toward the brightly lit stage. I did not stop when the ushers stepped forward. They saw the look on my face and immediately backed away. I did not stop when Connor noticed me approaching his fake smile collapsing into a mask of pure panic. I walked straight up the carpeted stairs and stepped directly onto the main stage. Richard frowned, stepping slightly away from the podium. He tried to maintain his polished composure, holding his hand over the microphone. "What are you doing?" Richard hissed under his breath, his eyes darting to the hundreds of guests watching us. "Get off this stage immediately." I did not answer him. I stepped right into his personal space, reached out and firmly wrapped my hand around the microphone stand. Richard tried to pull it away, but my hands were built from 40 years of turning wrenches and lifting engine blocks. I ripped the microphone from his grip with a single, effortless motion. Richard stumbled backward, shocked by the physical strength of a man he considered weak. I turned my back to him and faced the silent ballroom. I did not look at the politicians or the corporate executives. I looked directly at the head table. I looked directly at my daughter. "Maya," I said, my voice echoing like thunder through the massive speakers. "Your father-in-law just told 600 people that his son is a generous savior who rescued you from nothing. He just told this room that Connor is elevating you." Maya stared at me, her tears frozen, completely stunned by my sudden appearance on the stage. Connor was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow and rapid. "But I need you to know exactly what your generous savior was doing 20 minutes before you walked down that aisle." I continued, my voice steady, cold, and absolutely relentless. "While you were putting on your white dress, thinking about the beautiful future you were going to build, the man sitting next to you cornered me in a catering closet near the bathrooms." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy guests leaned forward, completely captivated by the unfolding disaster. "Connor did not come to me to ask for my blessing," I said, pointing a finger directly at the groom. "He locked the door and pulled out a legal power of attorney document. He demanded that I sign over the deed to the house you grew up in. He demanded my property. And do you know what he said he would do if I refused?" Maya shook her head slowly, her lips trembling. She turned to look at Connor, who was desperately shaking his head, mouthing the word "no" over and over again. "He told me that if I did not give him my home, he would walk out to this very ballroom, cancel the wedding, and publicly destroy your reputation by telling everyone in this room that you were a cheater." I declared the truth, ringing through the hall like a heavy bell. "He threatened to ruin your life in front of the mayor, the press, and his entire family if I did not pay his extortion fee. He did not marry you to save you, Maya. He married you because he thought your father was a weak, poor old man he could easily rob to cover his own pathetic failures." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a catastrophic car crash when the dust is still settling and nobody knows who is still alive. Maya stood up from her chair. The beautiful silk train of her wedding dress caught on the carpet, but she did not care. She looked down at Connor. The man she loved, the man she had defended to me just a few nights ago, was shrinking into his seat. He was not denying it. He could not form a single coherent word. His terrifying guilt was written all over his sweating, pale face. Maya let out a broken, agonizing sob. She took a step away from him, realizing in real time that her entire relationship was a manufactured lie. On the stage behind me, Richard Sterling completely lost his mind. His perfect high society event, the wedding he had orchestrated to show off his wealth and power, was being torn to shreds by a man he considered lower than dirt. The humiliation of his son, The public exposure of his family's absolute lack of morals shattered his aristocratic facade into a million pieces. His face turned a dangerous, violent shade of purple. "You lying, pathetic piece of garbage!" Richard screamed, losing every ounce of his polished etiquette. I turned around just in time to see him lunge toward the podium. He grabbed a heavy crystal glass filled to the brim with ice water that had been set out for the speakers. He did not hesitate. He threw the entire contents of the glass directly into my face with all the violent rage he possessed. The freezing water hit my face with the force of an open-handed slap. Ice cubes bounced off my chest and shattered against the polished Italian marble floor of the Grand Monarch Ballroom. For a moment, the only sound in that massive, opulent space was the dripping of water from my chin onto my crisp white shirt. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped. The soft playing of the string quartet in the corner died out in a discordant scrape of a bow. 600 guests, the absolute pinnacle of the city's wealthy white elite, froze in their tracks and turned their eyes toward me. Standing less than 2 feet away from me was Richard Sterling. He held the empty crystal glass in his hand, his posture rigid with arrogant satisfaction. "Time to wake up, old mechanic." Richard sneered, a cruel smile stretching across his face. "You might have bought a nice suit for today, but do not ever mistake yourself for one of us. Your place is not up here on the main stage standing next to my son. Your place is in the back, out of sight, where you belong." I did not raise my hand to wipe the water from my face. I did not blink. I did not step back. I just stood there, letting the cold drops run down my neck, absorbing the absolute magnitude of his mistake. I reached into my tailored suit, wrapped my fingers around the heavy security radio, and prepared to burn his entire world to the ground. I spent 40 years wiping engine grease off my hands so my daughter could wear silk. But on her wedding day, standing in the middle of a 5-star ballroom, her new father-in-law decided I was a stain that needed to be washed away. He threw a glass of ice water right in my face in front of 600 elite guests. The room went dead silent. He expected me to lower my head, apologize for my mere existence, and walk out the back door like a beaten dog. Instead, I slowly reached into my tailored suit, pulled out a radio, and gave a single command that erased his entire corporate empire in less than 60 seconds. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed the Sterling family, let me know what city you are listening from down in the comments. And if you believe that true power never has to shout, hit that like and subscribe button. The freezing water dripped from my chin and soaked into the crisp white collar of my tuxedo shirt. A single ice cube slid down my lapel and shattered against the polished marble stage. For a few agonizing seconds, the grand ballroom of the Grand Monarch was entirely stripped of its music, its laughter, and its elite arrogance. There were 600 people in that room. Politicians, real estate tycoons, and old money socialites, and not a single one of them dared to take a breath. They were all completely paralyzed, their eyes locked on the 74-year-old black man who had just been publicly baptized in humiliation by the wealthy father of the groom. Richard Sterling stood less than 2 feet away from me. His chest was heaving up and down beneath his tailored suit. His face was flushed with a violent, ugly shade of red. He held the empty crystal glass tightly in his fist, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. He was panting like a man who had just won a grueling physical fight, even though all he had done was throw a glass of water at an elderly man who was standing perfectly still. He glared at me with absolute contempt. He expected my shoulders to slump. He expected my eyes to drop to the floor. He expected me to turn around in shame, walk down the carpeted stairs, and exit through the kitchen doors where he believed I belonged. But I did not move a single inch. I stood my ground, my posture as straight and unyielding as the steel beams I used to build my very first warehouse 30 years ago. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I just stared back at him with a cold, terrifying calm that he could not possibly comprehend. My daughter Maya let out a choked, devastated sob from the head table behind him. I could hear the heartbreak in her voice, the sound of her entire fairy tale collapsing into a nightmare. Connor, the coward she had just married, did not even try to comfort her. He remained frozen in his chair, his face slick with sweat, staring at me with the wide, terrified eyes of a man who knew exactly what was coming. Connor knew about the fake signature. He knew the extortion had failed. But his arrogant father remained completely clueless. Richard scoffed, a short and bitter sound that broke the heavy silence. He curled his lip in disgust and told me to get off his stage. He said the show was over and that I had embarrassed my daughter enough for one night. He spoke to me as if I were a stubborn dog that refused to follow a simple command. I slowly raised my right hand. The movement was so deliberate, so unhurried, that it made Richard flinch backward just a fraction of an inch. He thought I was going to strike him. He thought I was going to retaliate with physical violence. But I am not a man who fights with my fists anymore. I fight with absolute crushing leverage. I reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket and pulled out a simple folded white cotton handkerchief. I brought the cloth to my face and began to wipe the freezing water from my cheeks. I moved with the slow, methodical precision of a mechanic wiping engine grease off his hands after finishing a long, grueling job. I dried my forehead. I wiped my chin. I dabbed the moisture from the collar of my shirt. The 600 guests watched this simple action in profound, uncomfortable silence. My refusal to react emotionally was destroying the narrative Richard had tried to build. I was not acting like a defeated victim. I was acting like a man who had just been inconvenienced by a minor, pathetic bug. I carefully folded the damp handkerchief and placed it back into my pocket. Then I looked Richard directly in the eyes. His smug, victorious expression was beginning to crack, replaced by a creeping, deep-seated unease. He did not understand why I was not broken. He did not understand the absolute stillness radiating from my body. I reached into the opposite side of my jacket and wrapped my fingers around the heavy, encrypted security radio. I pulled it out and held it up in the bright stage lights. It was a thick, matte black device, the kind used by elite tactical teams and high-level executive security. It looked completely out of place in the hands of a retired auto mechanic. Richard stared at the device, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He asked me what I thought I was doing. He mocked me, asking if I was calling a taxi to take me back to the slums. I did not answer him. I simply pressed the transmission button on the side of the radio. The sharp digital chirp echoed loudly through the silent ballroom, amplifying the tension in the air. I brought the radio close to my mouth, keeping my eyes locked on Richard. "This is Marcus Blackwood," I said, my voice deep and unwavering, carrying clearly through the room even without the microphone. "Initiate lockdown protocol immediately. Seal every single exit in the building, no one leaves this hall, and drop the main projector screen on the stage right now." I released the button. Another sharp chirp confirmed the transmission was complete. For a moment, the ballroom remained completely still. The wealthy guests looked at each other in utter bewilderment. They heard me give a command, but they could not process what it meant. They could not understand why an old black man from a poor neighborhood was giving security orders inside one of the most exclusive and heavily guarded venues in the entire city. Richard stared at me for 3 long seconds. He processed the words I had spoken into the radio, and then he threw his head back and burst into a loud, theatrical laugh. It was a harsh, mocking sound designed to regain control of the room. He turned to face the audience, gesturing toward me with his empty hand. He called me a lunatic. He announced to the crowd that the stress of the evening had clearly broken my fragile, uneducated mind. He turned back to me, his face twisted in a mask of absolute arrogant pity. "Are you completely out of your mind, old man?" Richard sneered, his voice ringing out across the silent tables. "Do you think you are in some cheap action movie? Do you think you have any authority here? Look around you. This is the Grand Monarch. This building is a fortress for the elite. You do not give orders here. You do not belong here. You are nothing but an invited guest who has overstayed his welcome." He stepped closer to me, his chest puffed out, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me into backing down. He pointed a finger directly at my face. "You think you can just press a button on a plastic toy and lock down a building you could not afford to rent for a single hour?" Richard mocked, his voice dripping with venomous confidence. "I am done playing games with you. You want to ruin my son's wedding. You want to act like a crazy person. Fine." Richard turned away from me and looked toward the back of the massive ballroom where the heavy mahogany entrance doors were located. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers aggressively. "Security!" Richard bellowed, his voice filled with the unquestionable entitlement of a man who believes the entire world works for him. "Get in here right now. Grab this crazy old mechanic and drag him out of my sight. Throw him out into the street where he belongs." He turned back to face me, a triumphant, cruel smirk stretching across his face. He crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for the venue guards to rush the stage, tackle me to the ground, and humiliate me in front of my daughter and his 600 wealthy friends. He truly believed he was the absolute master of his domain. He truly believed his wealth and his skin color gave him the ultimate authority in that room. He had absolutely no idea that he was standing in my house. He had no idea that every single security guard, every valet, and every manager in that massive building signed a paycheck with my hidden corporate logo on it. I did not flinch as Richard screamed for the guards. I just stood there watching the smug satisfaction radiating from his face. I listened to the heavy, synchronized footsteps echoing from the back of the hall. The massive mahogany doors were pushed wide open, and the crowd gasped as a dozen men in tailored black suits stepped into the ballroom. Richard's smile grew wider. He thought his cavalry had arrived. He thought the show was finally over. He was about to find out that the show had only just begun. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom did not just open. They were shoved apart with a violent, synchronized force that sent a booming echo across the marble floor. The murmurs of the 600 elite guests instantly died in their throats. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Through the wide opening marched 10 men. They were not the standard venue ushers in polite gray vests. These were high-level executive protection agents dressed in immaculate tailored black suits, wearing discreet earpieces and moving with a terrifying military precision. They stepped into the ballroom in a perfect wedge formation, their faces carved out of solid stone. Leading the formation was a man everyone in that room of high society recognized. It was Mr. Harrington, the general manager and executive director of the Grand Monarch. Harrington was a man who catered only to billionaires, royalty, and international diplomats. He was notorious for his strict, unyielding control over the venue. Seeing him personally lead a security detail into the middle of a wedding reception was completely unprecedented. Standing next to me on the stage, Richard Sterling let out a loud, victorious breath. He crossed his arms over his chest and nodded approvingly at the approaching squad. He genuinely believed his command had summoned them. He actually thought his wealthy status was the gravitational pull bringing this massive display of force into the room to do his bidding. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight, waiting for the moment these men in black suits would tackle me to the ground, snap handcuffs on my wrists, and drag me out the service door like common trash. The guards marched straight down the center aisle. The wealthy politicians and corporate titans hastily pulled their chairs in, shrinking back from the sheer intimidating presence of the security detail. The rhythmic thud of their polished shoes hitting the marble floor sounded like the beating of a massive, unstoppable drum. Richard took a step to the very edge of the stage, puffed out his chest, and pointed his index finger directly at my face. "Right here, Harrington," Richard barked, his voice filled with arrogant authority. "This lunatic just assaulted me on my son's stage and tried to threaten the guests. Get your men up here, secure his arms, and throw him out into the street. I will be pressing formal charges in the morning." The security detail reached the foot of the stage, but they did not fan out to surround me. They did not reach into their jackets for handcuffs. They completely ignored Richard Sterling. They marched straight past the angry pointing millionaire and formed a perfect, impenetrable wall of black suits directly in front of the main podium. They turned their backs to the audience, creating a protective barrier between the stage and the 600 guests. Richard stood there with his arms still outstretched, his index finger pointing at nothing. His arrogant smile froze. His brain simply could not process why the guards had completely bypassed his direct order. He opened his mouth to shout another command, but the words died in his throat when Mr. Harrington stepped onto the stage. Harrington did not look at Richard. He did not even acknowledge the father of the groom was standing there. The highly respected general manager walked with measured, deliberate steps directly toward me. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from where I stood. He smoothed the front of his jacket, placed his hands sharply at his sides, and bent forward at the waist. It was not a polite nod. It was a deep, absolute 90-degree bow of profound reverence and total submission. Mr. Chairman Harrington said, his voice carrying through the deadly quiet ballroom without needing a microphone. "The facility is fully secured. The main entrances, service elevators, and loading docks have been locked down. The security system has been activated on your direct orders. No one enters or leaves without your explicit permission. We await your further command." The silence that descended upon the Grand Monarch was no longer just awkward or tense. It was apocalyptic. It was the sound of a completely fabricated reality being ripped apart at the seams. 600 wealthy elite guests stopped breathing simultaneously. The wine glasses stopped halfway to their mouths. The politicians who had been laughing at me moments ago suddenly looked like they had seen a ghost. Harrington stood back up, his posture rigid, waiting for my instruction. He treated me with the absolute deference reserved only for a sovereign king, and in this building that is exactly what I was. I slowly turned my head to look at Richard Sterling. The physical transformation happening to his body was an absolute masterpiece of psychological devastation. The violent, angry red flush that had covered his face just moments ago completely vanished, instantly replaced by an unnatural, sickly ash white. The color drained from his skin so fast he looked as if he were actively bleeding out. His mouth hung open, his jaw slack, trying to form words that his paralyzed vocal cords refused to produce. His hands, which had just thrown freezing water into my face, were now trembling uncontrollably at his sides. He looked at Harrington, the powerful manager who bowed to me. He looked at the wall of elite security guards protecting me. And then he looked back at me, the old black mechanic from South Chicago. The gears in his head were grinding against each other violently, stripping away decades of built-in prejudice and unearned superiority. He was realizing in real time that the man he had bullied, insulted, and tried to extort was not a helpless victim. He was realizing that he had just kicked a sleeping Leviathan directly in the teeth. Behind him at the head table, Connor had completely collapsed into his chair. He had his head in his hands, his fingers pulling desperately at his own hair. Connor knew the truth about the fraudulent loans, but even he did not know the sheer magnitude of the power I wielded. He was weeping silently, a pathetic display of a man whose house of cards had just been hit by a Category 5 hurricane. And Maya, my beautiful daughter, she was standing perfectly still, her eyes darting between me and the bowing manager. She had spent her entire life watching me put on greasy overalls and drive an old pickup truck. She had watched me count coupons at the grocery store to teach her the value of $1. She had never known the empire I built in the shadows. Now she was watching the most powerful men in the city bow to her father. The shock in her eyes was profound, but underneath it I could see a fierce, dawning realization of exactly who her father really was. Richard finally managed to choke out a single pathetic sound. He took a stumbling, unsteady step backward, his expensive leather shoes catching on the carpet. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its former booming confidence. "What is happening? Harrington, what are you doing? Why are you bowing to him? He is just a mechanic. He is nobody." I stepped forward. I did not raise my voice. When you possess absolute power, you do not need to shout. The acoustics of the massive room carried my words to every single terrified guest sitting at the tables. "You told me to wake up Richard," I said, my voice cold, steady, and entirely merciless. "You told me to remember my place. You looked at the color of my skin and the calluses on my hands, and you assumed I was nothing but a peasant allowed to breathe the same air as the great Sterling family. You thought you could invite me into this fortress of wealth, throw water in my face, and humiliate me in front of the world." I took another step toward him, closing the distance. Richard shrank back, his shoulders curving inward, physically diminishing under the weight of my presence. "But you made a catastrophic miscalculation," I continued, letting the words strike him like physical blows. "You see, Richard, you do not own the ground you are standing on. You are merely a guest in my house. You rented this room for a few hours to show off your fake wealth to your fake friends. But the walls surrounding you, the marble beneath your feet, and the very air circulating through those vents belong to me." I gestured with my hand toward the grand ceiling and the opulent walls of the ballroom. "The 5-star hall you are standing in, the entire Grand Monarch estate, and every single corporate asset attached to this property is wholly owned by Blackwood Holdings." I paused, letting the name hang in the dead, suffocating silence of the room. The name Blackwood Holdings was legendary in this city's financial circles. It was known as an invisible juggernaut, an aggressive real estate conglomerate that devoured everything in its path. Every politician and corporate executive in the audience knew that name, and I could see the absolute terror erupt in their eyes as they connected the dots. Richard gasped a raw, wheezing intake of air. His knees actually buckled slightly, as if an invisible weight had just been dropped onto his spine. "And I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that sealed his fate forever, am Marcus Blackwood." The words struck the room like a localized earthquake. The sheer impossibility of the revelation crashed down on the Sterling family. Richard Sterling had not just insulted his son's father-in-law. He had publicly assaulted one of the most powerful and ruthless anonymous billionaires in the state. He had thrown a glass of ice water into the face of the man who owned the entire board they were playing on. I did not give him a second to process the horror. I did not give him a moment to apologize or grovel. I turned my attention away from his pale, trembling face and looked up at the ceiling. "Drop the screen," I commanded. With a loud mechanical whir, the massive theater-sized projector screen began to descend slowly from the ceiling directly behind the stage. The physical trap had been completely locked down, and now it was time to show the 600 people in this room exactly what kind of criminals the Sterling family truly were. The mechanical whir of the massive projector screen descending from the ceiling was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. It rolled down slowly behind the main stage, unfurling like the heavy curtain of a public execution. I reached into my tuxedo pocket and pulled out a small wireless remote. I had instructed my security team to connect my encrypted server directly to the audiovisual system of the Grand Monarch. The state-of-the-art projector mounted high above us flickered to life, casting a blindingly bright, high-definition glow across the stage. I turned away from Richard Sterling, leaving him trembling in his frozen state of shock, and I pointed a single finger toward the giant screen. "Let us begin with the groom," I announced, my voice echoing through the premium surround sound speakers, reaching every single one of the 600 elite guests sitting in the dark. "The man your father just praised as a visionary. The noble savior who graciously pulled my daughter out of the slums. Let us show this room exactly what kind of nobility the Sterling family represents." I pressed the button on my remote. The screen flashed, displaying a highly confidential corporate termination letter bearing the official logo of the prestigious wealth management firm where Connor supposedly worked. The text was enlarged so even the guests in the back row could read the devastating words. "Connor Sterling is not a senior investment director," I stated, pacing slowly across the stage with the absolute authority of a judge reading a final verdict. "He has not managed a single legitimate portfolio in half a year. He was fired 6 months ago for gross negligence and unauthorized use of corporate funds. Every single morning, this man put on a custom-tailored suit, kissed my daughter goodbye, and went to sit in an upscale coffee shop to play pretend. He is entirely unemployed. He is an absolute hollow fraud." A collective gasp rippled through the sea of wealthy politicians and corporate titans. The high society wives covered their mouths in shock. Richard Sterling whipped his head around to stare at the screen, his eyes wide with utter disbelief. He looked down at his son, expecting Connor to stand up and deny the accusations. But Connor was completely folded in half at the head table, his face buried in his hands, weeping like a cornered child. "But unemployment is not a crime," I continued, my voice growing colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. "Being a pathetic liar is not illegal. What is illegal, however, is what Connor was doing to fund his miserable illusion." I clicked the remote a second time. The screen shifted to a sprawling digital spreadsheet accompanied by terrifying screenshots of encrypted text messages. The numbers on the screen were highlighted in a glowing, bloody red. "Connor Sterling is a desperate, drowning gambling addict," I declared, letting the words strike the room like physical blows. "He owes $500,000 in underground sports betting, and he does not owe this money to a polite bank that sends friendly reminder letters. He owes $500,000 to a highly violent criminal syndicate operating in the shadows of this city. Men who break bones and destroy lives when they are not paid on time." The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of frantic, panicked whispers. The wealthy elite were suddenly realizing they were attending a wedding funded by a man targeted by the criminal underworld. "This massive, suffocating debt is exactly why Richard and Connor invited me to the country club 3 months ago," I explained, looking down at Richard, who was now physically shrinking under the weight of the public humiliation. "This is why they demanded I hand over the deed to my home. They were not asking for a wedding gift. They were trying to extort an old mechanic to pay a blood ransom to keep the wolves away from their perfect white picket fence." I paused, letting the absolute disgust settle over the crowd. Then I turned my attention entirely to the head table. I looked at Maya. My beautiful, brilliant daughter was sitting perfectly still, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the massive screen in absolute horror. "But extortion was not his worst crime," I said softly, my voice filled with a father's profound sorrow and burning rage. "Because when I refused to hand over my property, Connor realized the violent men were coming for him. He needed cash immediately. And since his credit was completely destroyed, he needed a clean, spotless financial record to secure high-interest offshore loans. He needed a human shield." I clicked the remote for the third time. The screen filled with digital loan applications from highly predatory, unregulated offshore lenders. I zoomed in tightly on the applicant details and the signature line. The name on the documents was not Connor Sterling. The social security number did not belong to him. He stole my daughter's identity. I roared, the anger finally bleeding through my calm facade. He stole Maya's social security number. He forged her signature on multiple fraudulent loans. The man who just stood at an altar and promised before God to protect my daughter has secretly shackled her to $500,000 of violent criminal debt. He offered her up as a sacrificial lamb to save his own cowardly skin. To leave absolutely zero room for doubt, I clicked the remote one final time. The screen transitioned from documents to the high-definition video I had recorded just an hour ago in the VIP corridor. The giant screen illuminated Connor's terrified, sweating face as he leaned against the wallpaper begging the loan sharks on his cell phone. His panicked voice blasted through the ballroom speakers with crystal-clear precision. "No, no, leave my wife out of this," the digital Connor pleaded on the screen. "Maya does not know anything about the loans. She has no idea I used her social security number. I have the deed. I forced the old black man to sign over the power of attorney an hour ago. He is a terrified, broken old mechanic. He did not even put up a fight. The video proved everything. It proved the identity theft. It proved the extortion. It proved that his entire relationship with Maya was nothing but a calculated financial extraction." I stopped the video, leaving Connor's pathetic, sweating face frozen on the massive screen for all of high society to see. At the head table, the illusion was completely dead. Maya stood up slowly. Her breathtaking white wedding gown rustled against the floor, but the fairy tale was entirely gone. She looked at the giant screen, and then she looked down at the sniveling, weeping man sitting next to her. The man who had used her, manipulated her, and secretly plotted to destroy her financial future. Connor finally looked up, his face covered in tears and sweat. He reached his trembling hands out toward her. "Maya, please." He choked out his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to understand. I was desperate. I was going to fix it. I love you. Please do not leave me." Maya did not cry. The shock and the heartbreak had instantly burned away, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked at him as if he were a rotting carcass left out in the sun. She reached down to her left hand and grabbed the massive, glittering engagement ring Connor had given her. A ring that was undoubtedly purchased with stolen funds or was nothing but a cheap piece of cubic zirconia. She ripped the ring off her finger with a violent tearing motion. She did not hand it back to him. She did not place it on the table. She pulled her arm back and threw the heavy ring directly at his face with all the strength she possessed. The metal struck Connor hard on the cheekbone, leaving an instant red mark before bouncing away onto the floor. "You are a lying, fraudulent bastard," Maya screamed, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom, completely raw and filled with absolute hatred. She turned her back on him entirely, gathered the heavy silk train of her wedding dress in her hands, and walked away from the head table. She did not look at the wealthy guests. She did not look at Richard. She walked straight toward the stage, straight toward me, leaving the shattered, pathetic ruins of Connor Sterling weeping alone in the spotlight. Maya stood by my side on the stage. I wrapped my arm around her trembling shoulders. She leaned into me, drawing strength from the father who had always protected her, the father she finally saw in his full, unyielding truth. We looked down at Connor, who was still sobbing on the floor like a broken child. The great Sterling heir was nothing but a puddle of tears and fake apologies. But the cancer in this room did not start with Connor. It started with the man who taught him that arrogance could perfectly mask incompetence. I turned my eyes back to Richard. Richard Sterling was breathing heavily. His face was a twisted, ugly mask of absolute humiliation and raw, untamed fury. His perfect high society event was a smoldering crater. His golden boy son was just exposed as a desperate federal criminal in front of the mayor, city councilman, and every elite family in the state. But men like Richard do not know how to surrender gracefully. They are poisoned by their own hubris. Even when the ship is resting at the bottom of the dark ocean, they will fiercely claim they are just enjoying a private submarine tour. Richard straightened his soaked tuxedo jacket. He clenched his fists at his sides, trying to summon the last pathetic shreds of his aristocratic authority. He glared at me, his eyes burning with a desperate, venomous hatred that he could no longer hide behind a polite country club smile. "Do not think you have won." Richard spat, his voice trembling but desperately trying to sound menacing. "Do you think a flashy presentation and some hidden money makes you a god in this city? You are nothing but an old mechanic who got lucky on a few real estate deals. You think you can intimidate me. You think you can destroy the Sterling legacy with a cheap parlor trick." He took a step forward, trying to puff out his chest and reclaim the physical space on the stage. He looked out at the silent, terrified crowd, desperately trying to rally his wealthy peers to his side. "Do not overreact," Richard barked, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You exposed my idiot son. Fine. He made his own bed. He will handle his own mess. But do not ever think you can touch me. Sterling Construction is a massive institution. We built the skyline of this city. We have weathered economic crashes, global recessions, and men far more powerful than you. We are not afraid of some bitter old man throwing a temper tantrum on a stage. My company is completely untouchable. I looked at him with profound absolute pity. He was standing directly on a trapdoor with a thick rope tied tightly around his neck, and he was using his final breaths to brag about the quality of the wood beneath his feet. I did not yell back. I did not hurl insults. I let him finish his pathetic, desperate speech. Then I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket for the final time that night. I pulled out a thick, folded legal document printed on premium heavy watermarked paper. Your company is an institution. I repeated, my voice dropping to a cold, echoing calmness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Your company is a hollow, rotting shell. You have not turned a legitimate profit in 3 years. You are dodging calls from furious subcontractors. You are illegally shifting new investor money just to keep the lights on in your corporate lobby. Your grand legacy is nothing but a massive Ponzi scheme dressed up in imported Italian silk. Richard's arrogant scowl faltered for a second. A small, terrifying seed of doubt planted itself in his eyes. He did not understand how I knew the intimate, highly classified details of his internal corporate ledgers. For the last 3 weeks, I continued holding the thick document up under the bright stage lights for the entire ballroom to see. You have been begging on your hands and knees for a financial lifeline. You have a $5 million institutional loan that was set to mature next week. Without that money, Sterling Construction goes into immediate corporate receivership. You would be locked out of your own glass headquarters before Monday morning. Richard swallowed hard. The aggressive color that had returned to his face drained away once again. His hands began to twitch. But a miracle happened for you yesterday, did it not? I said, stepping closer to him, closing the trap. You received an email from an investment fund called Vanguard Apex Capital. They approved your desperate plea for a 12-month extension. You signed the paperwork electronically this very morning. You walked into this wedding tonight thinking you had successfully cheated death. You thought Vanguard Apex Capital saved your miserable life. I took one final deliberate step toward him. He shrank back, entirely consumed by the creeping horror of realization. Vanguard Apex Capital is a shadow subsidiary, Richard I stated, letting the absolute weight of the reality crush his lungs. It is a private equity wing wholly owned and operated by Blackwood Holdings. I am the chairman of the board. I am the sole shot caller. I am your bank. The collective gasp from the 600 guests sounded like all the oxygen being violently sucked out of the room at once. Richard stumbled backward. He looked exactly like a man who had just been shot directly in the chest, but had not quite realized he was bleeding to death yet. No, Richard whispered, shaking his head frantically, his perfectly styled silver hair falling out of place. No, that is completely impossible. My corporate lawyers reviewed the contract. The terms were completely standard. The terms were mostly standard. I corrected him, my voice completely devoid of mercy or compassion. Except for one very specific addition. I personally ordered my fund managers to insert into the core covenants of your life-saving extension a highly aggressive, non-negotiable morality clause. I unfolded the thick document, the crisp paper snapping sharply in the quiet room, and I recited the clause out loud for the entire ballroom of high society elites to hear. If the borrower engages in any behavior that brings public scandal, criminal association, or severe ethical disrepute to themselves or the lending institution, the lender retains the absolute right to take immediate punitive action without prior warning. I lowered the paper and stared directly into Richard's wide, terrified eyes. You just stood on a stage and publicly admitted your son is a fraud, I said, ticking off the offenses with cold precision. Your son is about to be indicted for federal identity theft. But more importantly, Richard, you just threw a glass of freezing water directly into the face of the chairman of your lending institution in front of 600 witnesses. I would say that qualifies as severe ethical disrepute. Richard's mouth opened wide, but absolutely no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer devastating magnitude of his own catastrophic stupidity. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him, and he had practically begged me to pull the trigger. Therefore, I declared, my voice ringing with final, absolute authority based on your egregious violation of the morality clause, I am officially declaring your extension null and void. I am recalling the entire $5 million debt. Not next month, not next week, right this very second. You are completely bankrupt. The moment the final word left my mouth, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the dead silence of the ballroom. It was a cell phone ringing. It was not coming from the stunned audience. It was coming from the inside pocket of Richard Sterling's soaked tailored tuxedo jacket. Richard flinched violently, as if the phone had physically burned his skin. He stood there trembling from head to toe, staring at me with eyes completely hollowed out by terror. The phone kept ringing, a loud, obnoxious, repetitive tone that echoed off the high marble walls. "Answer it, Richard," I commanded quietly. "It is incredibly rude to keep your employees waiting." With shaking, uncoordinated hands, Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He stared at the bright screen. Even from a few feet away, I could clearly see the caller ID. It was his chief financial officer. He slowly brought the phone to his ear and accepted the call. He did not say a single word. He just listened. The acoustics in the room were so quiet that I could faintly hear the panicked, high-pitched voice screaming on the other end of the line. The chief financial officer was absolutely hysterical. He was shouting that all of the corporate bank accounts had just been frozen. He was screaming that the primary lenders had initiated an emergency asset lockdown across the board. He was crying that the company credit cards were declining everywhere and that armed security forces were already arriving at the main construction sites to chain the heavy steel gates shut. Richard did not respond to his frantic employee. He could not form a single thought. The phone slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers. It hit the hardwood floor of the stage with a loud, hollow thud, the voice of his panicked accountant still screaming desperately from the tiny speaker. Richard Sterling, the proud, arrogant, racist aristocrat who thought he could treat me like dirt on his shoe, completely collapsed. His knees simply gave out beneath him. He dropped heavily into a nearby wooden chair, his arms hanging lifelessly at his sides. He stared blankly at the floor, his chest heaving, his mouth hanging open in silent agony. His entire empire, his generational legacy, and his entire identity had been completely vaporized in less than 60 seconds. The towering house of cards had completely collapsed. The grand stage of the ballroom, once a pedestal for the Sterling family to project their fake supremacy, was now the site of their absolute ruin. I stood beside my daughter, feeling the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart, while the two men who had tried to destroy us disintegrated before my eyes. Richard was nothing more than an empty suit slumped in a wooden chair, staring at his dropped cell phone as if it were a venomous snake. But the real spectacle of cowardice was happening right at my feet. Connor Sterling, the golden boy, the man who had confidently threatened to ruin my daughter's reputation just an hour ago, finally broke. He realized that his father could no longer save him. He realized the criminal syndicate was still coming for him, and now he had absolutely no money to buy his life back. He scrambled across the floor on his hands and knees. He did not care about his expensive tuxedo. He did not care that 600 of the wealthiest people in the city were watching him. He lunged forward and wrapped his arms tightly around Maya's legs, burying his tear-soaked face into the fabric of her beautiful white wedding dress. "Maya, please," Connor wailed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic sob. "You have to help me. You have to tell your father to stop this. I will do anything. I will go to rehab. I will get a real job. Just please do not let them take me down. I love you. You know I love you." It was the most sickening display of manipulation I had ever witnessed. He was still trying to use her empathy against her. He was still hoping that the sweet, caring woman he had deceived would throw herself over the grenade for him. Maya looked down at the man clutching her legs. She did not cry. Her eyes were hard, filled with a strength that made my chest swell with immense pride. She reached down, grabbed his hands, and forcefully pried his fingers off her dress. "Do not ever touch me again," Maya said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You do not love me, Connor. You love my credit score. You love the money you thought you could steal from my father. You are nothing but a parasite." She took a deliberate step backward, putting herself entirely behind my shoulder. She was done. The spell was broken. Connor reached out toward her again, grabbing at the empty air, completely devastated by the realization that his human shield had just walked away. He opened his mouth to beg once more, but the words were completely drowned out by a new sound piercing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. It started as a faint wail in the distance, echoing through the busy streets of the city. But it grew louder, sharper, and more urgent with every passing second. The sound of multiple police sirens approaching the venue at high speed. The shrieking noise cut through the thick glass windows of the Grand Monarch, accompanied by the chaotic flashing of harsh red and blue lights that reflected off the crystal chandeliers. The 600 elite guests began to murmur in panic. They shifted in their seats, craning their necks toward the grand entrance. They knew exactly what those sirens meant. Connor froze on the floor. His bloodshot eyes widened in absolute paralyzing terror. He looked up at me, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. "What did you do?" Connor whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening sound of the approaching sirens. I looked down at him with a cold, unyielding stare. "I told you I was going to expose you," I replied simply. "Did you really think I was just going to show a video and let you walk away? You committed federal identity theft. You forged my daughter's signature on unregulated loans to pay off a violent criminal syndicate. I sent the evidence to my legal team the moment you confessed in the hallway. They did not just sit on it. They handed a perfectly wrapped, undeniable case file directly to the authorities." The sheer panic on Connor's face was a masterpiece. He realized he was not just losing his luxurious lifestyle, he was losing his freedom. The massive mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open for the second time that night. My private security detail parted smoothly, creating a wide, clear path down the center aisle. Through the doors marched 6 uniformed police officers flanked by 2 plainclothes detectives wearing badges on their belts. They did not pause to admire the floral arrangements or the expensive decor. They walked with swift, absolute purpose directly toward the main stage. The wealthy politicians and corporate executives in the audience shrank back into their chairs, terrified of being associated with the unfolding criminal scandal. The lead detective stepped up to the head table. He looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling on the floor. "Connor Sterling," the detective announced, his voice loud and authoritative. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, felony identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. Please stand up and put your hands behind your back." Connor let out a gut-wrenching, terrified scream. He tried to scramble backward, completely losing whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. 2 uniformed officers immediately stepped forward, grabbed him by the arms, and hauled him to his feet. He struggled weakly, but he was no match for the police. They forced his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of cold steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over the murmurs of the crowd. The heavy chains locked tightly over the sleeves of his custom-tailored groom tuxedo. It was the ultimate public execution of a man's reputation. The golden boy of the Sterling family, the man who had looked down his nose at my background and my skin color, was now standing in the middle of his own opulent wedding reception wearing stainless steel bracelets. Connor thrashed wildly in the grip of the police officers. His face was soaked with tears and sweat. He turned his desperate, panicked eyes toward the stage, looking for the one man who had always bailed him out of his mistakes. "Dad," Connor screamed, his voice cracking in sheer terror. "Dad, help me. Tell them who we are. Call our lawyers. Do not let them take me away. Dad, please." The entire ballroom turned their attention to Richard Sterling, the great patriarch, the man who had boasted about his power and his legacy just 15 minutes ago. Richard was still slumped in the wooden chair on the stage. But he was not looking at his son. He was not rushing to defend his boy from the police. He was completely and utterly ignoring the fact that his only child was being dragged away in handcuffs. Richard had picked up his phone from the floor. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely press the buttons on the screen. He held the device to his ear, his eyes wide and vacant, completely consumed by his own catastrophic ruin. "Hello, David," Richard stammered into the phone, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper that the nearby microphones picked up. "It is Richard Sterling. I need a massive favor. I need a bridge loan. $5 million. Just for a few weeks. The banks froze my accounts. Please, you have to help me." He paused, listening to the response. His face fell even further. The person on the other end had clearly hung up on him. Richard frantically dialed another number. "Michael," Richard begged, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Michael, do not hang up. I need liquidity. My company is in receivership. I will give you 30% equity, 40%. Just wire me the funds, please." He was met with another dial tone. The wealthy friends he had spent his entire life trying to impress were abandoning him the second they smelled blood in the water. The elite class does not tolerate financial failure, and Richard was completely radioactive. Connor stood between the police officers, watching his father frantically dial number after number, begging for money, while his son was being hauled off to federal prison. The realization hit Connor like a freight train. His father did not care about him. His father only cared about the crumbling facade of the Sterling Empire. Dad, Connor wailed one last time, a miserable, broken sound that echoed through the hall. "Take him out of here," the detective ordered. The officers forcefully marched Connor down the center aisle, parading him past the hundreds of silent judging guests. The man who had threatened to humiliate my daughter was now enduring the most profound, inescapable public humiliation imaginable. He was shoved through the heavy mahogany doors and out into the cold night, accompanied by the flashing red and blue lights of his new reality. I stood on the stage holding my daughter's hand, watching the doors close behind him. The threat was eliminated. The parasite had been removed, but the night was not quite over yet. I turned my attention back to the gasping, frantic man sitting in the chair ready to deliver the final absolute blow to the Sterling name. The heavy mahogany doors closed with a loud, definitive thud behind the police officers who had just dragged Connor Sterling out into the night. The flashing red and blue lights that had painted the ballroom windows slowly faded away, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The Grand Monarch, which just an hour ago had been a glittering fortress of upper-class arrogance, now felt like a sprawling, empty graveyard for a fake dynasty. I stood on the main stage and looked out over the sea of tables. The illusion was completely shattered, and the rats were officially abandoning the sinking ship. The 600 elite guests, the powerful politicians, the real estate tycoons, and the high society snobs who had laughed at my expense were now caught in a state of absolute terrified panic. They realized they were sitting in a building owned by the very man they had just watched Richard Sterling humiliate. They realized that the invisible billionaire whose name commanded fear in every boardroom in the city was standing right in front of them, staring them down. No one wanted to be associated with the Sterling name for a single second longer. I watched as chairs were quietly pushed back. Expensive silk napkins were dropped carelessly onto half-eaten plates of food. Wives grabbed their husbands by the arms, whispering frantically, dragging them toward the side exits. They did not walk out with the arrogant strut they had arrived with. They kept their heads down, scurrying through the shadows, desperately trying to avoid making eye contact with me. They were fleeing the ballroom as if the very floorboards were infected with a deadly plague. I did not stop them. I let them run. I wanted them to spread the story of exactly what happens when you cross Marcus Blackwood. I turned my attention away from the fleeing cowards and looked at Mr. Harrington, the general manager of the venue, who was still standing at attention near the edge of the stage with his squad of elite security guards. He was waiting for my final command. "Mr. Harrington," I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of the retreating crowd. Harrington immediately stepped forward and bowed his head respectfully. "Yes, Mr. Chairman," he replied. "Look at this mess," I said, gesturing to the spilled water on the stage and the abandoned, chaotic tables scattered across the ballroom. "The Sterling family has completely ruined the atmosphere of this venue. I want every single member of their extended family removed from my property right now. Do not let them use the main lobby. Escort them out through the service corridors." "Understood." Sir Harrington nodded, waving his hand to signal his security team to move in. "And Harrington," I added, my voice dropping to a tone of pure, calculated disrespect, "do not bother charging Richard's corporate card for the damages and the early cancellation fees. His accounts are frozen and his plastic is entirely worthless. Box up their remaining belongings, stop them at the loading dock, and make them pay the standard cleaning fee in cash before you throw them out onto the pavement." It was the ultimate final degradation. Richard Sterling had spent his entire life hiding behind massive credit lines and corporate accounts, pretending he was royalty. Now he was going to be treated like a cheap patron at a late-night diner who had broken a glass and could not cover his tab. Harrington permitted himself a very small professional smile. "With pleasure, Mr. Chairman," he said. The security guards moved with terrifying efficiency. They descended upon the few remaining members of the Sterling family who were frozen in their seats. But my eyes were fixed solely on Richard. He was still slumped in the wooden chair on the stage. His phone was lying dead on the floor. His expensive tuxedo was soaked with the freezing water he had violently thrown at me. He was completely catatonic. His brain had simply shut down, unable to process the sheer crushing velocity of his absolute ruin. In the span of 20 minutes, he had lost his $5 million company, his generational wealth, his reputation, and his only son to the federal prison system. 2 large security guards stepped up onto the stage. They did not treat him with the polite deference reserved for billionaires. They treated him like a trespasser. "Time to go, sir," one of the guards stated bluntly, grabbing Richard by the arm of his ruined tuxedo jacket. Richard gasped, his eyes wide and vacant. He weakly tried to pull his arm away, but there was absolutely no strength left in his body. "Do you know who I am?" he mumbled, a pathetic, conditioned reflex pouring from his lips. "I am Richard Sterling. You cannot touch me. You are trespassing on private property," the guard replied coldly, completely unbothered by the empty threat. Walk, or we will carry you." They hauled him up to his feet. Richard's legs wobbled beneath him. He looked like a hollow, broken shell of a man. The guards did not march him down the grand center aisle where he had proudly strutted earlier that evening. They dragged him toward the back of the room, pushing him through the heavy swinging doors that led directly into the hot, greasy catering kitchens. They marched him past the dishwashers and the line cooks, forcing him to take the exact same humiliating path he had tried to banish me to when the night began. They pushed him down the concrete service hallways, stripping away the last remaining fragments of his aristocratic pride. When they finally reached the metal doors of the back loading dock, they shoved him outside. Richard stumbled forward and fell hard onto his hands and knees. The freezing night air of the city hit him immediately. There were no valet drivers waiting to fetch his luxury car. There were no photographers waiting to take his picture. He was kneeling on the cold, dirty concrete of a back alley, surrounded by industrial dumpsters and the smell of exhaust fumes. He had absolutely nothing left. His bank accounts were seized. His son was sitting in a holding cell. His wealthy friends had erased his number from their phones. He was just a cold, broke, pathetic old man kneeling in the dirt. I did not follow him out to the alley to watch him shiver. A lion does not need to watch the buzzards pick at the remains of his prey. I had finished my work. I stood on the quiet, empty stage of the grand ballroom. The massive room was finally still. The elite crowd was gone. The toxic presence of the Sterling family had been completely scrubbed from the building. There were only a few venue staff members quietly clearing tables in the distance. I turned around slowly. Maya was standing a few feet away from me. The anger and the shock that had consumed her when she threw the ring at Connor had passed, leaving behind a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. She looked at the empty space where her fake groom had been sitting. She looked at the massive projector screen that had exposed the terrifying truth about the family she almost joined. And then she looked up at me. She did not see Marcus Blackwood, the ruthless billionaire chairman. She did not see the man who had just destroyed a corporate empire with a single phone call. She just saw her father, the man who had stayed up late helping her with her math homework, the man who had worked double shifts to buy her a drafting table when she wanted to become an architect, the man who had promised her mother that he would never ever let anyone hurt their little girl. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, streaming down her cheeks. They were not tears of heartbreak for Connor. They were tears of absolute crushing relief. She realized how dangerously close she had come to tying her life to a monster, and she realized exactly what her father was willing to do to pull her out of the fire. "Dad." Maya whispered, her voice breaking into a soft, vulnerable sob. All the cold, calculating ice I had built up in my chest over the last 3 months melted away in an instant. I stepped off the podium, closed the distance between us, and opened my arms. Maya ran toward me. She buried her face in my shoulder, crying freely, holding on to me as tightly as she could. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a massive, warm embrace. I rested my chin on the top of her head, closing my eyes, and let out a long, heavy breath that I felt like I had been holding for decades. "I got you, sweetheart," I murmured gently, smoothing her hair just like I did when she was a little girl. "I got you. It is over now. You are safe." She sobbed against my chest, nodding slowly. We stood there together in the middle of the empty, glittering ballroom. The storm had finally passed. The liars had been exposed, the thieves had been locked away, and the people who thought they could trample on our dignity had been completely erased from our lives. We did not need their approval. We did not need their high society validation. We had the truth, we had our respect, and most importantly, we had each other. And as I held my daughter tight, I knew that was the only wealth in this world that truly mattered. The heavy mahogany doors closed with a loud, definitive thud behind the police officers who had just dragged Connor Sterling out into the night. The flashing red and blue lights that had painted the ballroom windows slowly faded away, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The Grand Monarch, which just an hour ago had been a glittering fortress of upper-class arrogance, now felt like a sprawling, empty graveyard for a fake dynasty. I stood on the main stage and looked out over the sea of tables. The illusion was completely shattered, and the rats were officially abandoning the sinking ship. The 600 elite guests, the powerful politicians, the real estate tycoons, and the high society snobs who had laughed at my expense were now caught in a state of absolute terrified panic. They realized they were sitting in a building owned by the very man they had just watched Richard Sterling humiliate. They realized that the invisible billionaire whose name commanded fear in every boardroom in the city was standing right in front of them, staring them down. No one wanted to be associated with the Sterling name for a single second longer. I watched as chairs were quietly pushed back. Expensive silk napkins were dropped carelessly onto half-eaten plates of food. Wives grabbed their husbands by the arms, whispering frantically, dragging them toward the side exits. They did not walk out with the arrogant strut they had arrived with. They kept their heads down, scurrying through the shadows, desperately trying to avoid making eye contact with me. They were fleeing the ballroom as if the very floorboards were infected with a deadly plague. I did not stop them. I let them run. I wanted them to spread the story of exactly what happens when you cross Marcus Blackwood. I turned my attention away from the fleeing cowards and looked at Mr. Harrington, the general manager of the venue, who was still standing at attention near the edge of the stage with his squad of elite security guards. He was waiting for my final command. "Mr. Harrington," I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of the retreating crowd. Harrington immediately stepped forward and bowed his head respectfully. "Yes, Mr. Chairman," he replied. "Look at this mess," I said, gesturing to the spilled water on the stage and the abandoned, chaotic tables scattered across the ballroom. "The Sterling family has completely ruined the atmosphere of this venue. I want every single member of their extended family removed from my property right now. Do not let them use the main lobby. Escort them out through the service corridors. Understood?" Sir Harrington nodded, waving his hand to signal his security team to move in. "And Harrington," I added, my voice dropping to a tone of pure, calculated disrespect, "do not bother charging Richard's corporate card for the damages and the early cancellation fees. His accounts are frozen and his plastic is entirely worthless. Box up their remaining belongings, stop them at the loading dock, and make them pay the standard cleaning fee in cash before you throw them out onto the pavement." It was the ultimate final degradation. Richard Sterling had spent his entire life hiding behind massive credit lines and corporate accounts, pretending he was royalty. Now he was going to be treated like a cheap patron at a late-night diner who had broken a glass and could not cover his tab. Harrington permitted himself a very small professional smile. "With pleasure, Mr. Chairman," he said. The security guards moved with terrifying efficiency. They descended upon the few remaining members of the Sterling family who were frozen in their seats. But my eyes were fixed solely on Richard. He was still slumped in the wooden chair on the stage. His phone was lying dead on the floor. His expensive tuxedo was soaked with the freezing water he had violently thrown at me. He was completely catatonic. His brain had simply shut down, unable to process the sheer crushing velocity of his absolute ruin. In the span of 20 minutes, he had lost his $5 million company, his generational wealth, his reputation, and his only son to the federal prison system. 2 large security guards stepped up onto the stage. They did not treat him with the polite deference reserved for billionaires. They treated him like a trespasser. "Time to go, sir," one of the guards stated bluntly, grabbing Richard by the arm of his ruined tuxedo jacket. Richard gasped, his eyes wide and vacant. He weakly tried to pull his arm away, but there was absolutely no strength left in his body. "Do you know who I am?" He mumbled, a pathetic conditioned reflex pouring from his lips. "I am Richard Sterling. You cannot touch me. You are trespassing on private property," the guard replied coldly, completely unbothered by the empty threat. "Walk, or we will carry you." They hauled him up to his feet. Richard's legs wobbled beneath him. He looked like a hollow, broken shell of a man. The guards did not march him down the grand center aisle where he had proudly strutted earlier that evening. They dragged him toward the back of the room, pushing him through the heavy swinging doors that led directly into the hot, greasy catering kitchens. They marched him past the dishwashers and the line cooks, forcing him to take the exact same humiliating path he had tried to banish me to when the night began. They pushed him down the concrete service hallways, stripping away the last remaining fragments of his aristocratic pride. When they finally reached the metal doors of the back loading dock, they shoved him outside. Richard stumbled forward and fell hard onto his hands and knees. The freezing night air of the city hit him immediately. There were no valet drivers waiting to fetch his luxury car. There were no photographers waiting to take his picture. He was kneeling on the cold, dirty concrete of a back alley surrounded by industrial dumpsters and the smell of exhaust fumes. He had absolutely nothing left. His bank accounts were seized. His son was sitting in a holding cell. His wealthy friends had erased his number from their phones. He was just a cold, broke, pathetic old man kneeling in the dirt. I did not follow him out to the alley to watch him shiver. A lion does not need to watch the buzzards pick at the remains of his prey. I had finished my work. I stood on the quiet, empty stage of the grand ballroom. The massive room was finally still. The elite crowd was gone. The toxic presence of the Sterling family had been completely scrubbed from the building. There were only a few venue staff members quietly clearing tables in the distance. I turned around slowly. Maya was standing a few feet away from me. The anger and the shock that had consumed her when she threw the ring at Connor had passed, leaving behind a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. She looked at the empty space where her fake groom had been sitting. She looked at the massive projector screen that had exposed the terrifying truth about the family she almost joined. And then she looked up at me. She did not see Marcus Blackwood, the ruthless billionaire chairman. She did not see the man who had just destroyed a corporate empire with a single phone call. She just saw her father, the man who had stayed up late helping her with her math homework, the man who had worked double shifts to buy her a drafting table when she wanted to become an architect, the man who had promised her mother that he would never ever let anyone hurt their little girl. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, streaming down her cheeks. They were not tears of heartbreak for Connor. They were tears of absolute crushing relief. She realized how dangerously close she had come to tying her life to a monster, and she realized exactly what her father was willing to do to pull her out of the fire. "Dad," Maya whispered, her voice breaking into a soft, vulnerable sob. All the cold, calculating ice I had built up in my chest over the last 3 months melted away in an instant. I stepped off the podium, closed the distance between us, and opened my arms. Maya ran toward me. She buried her face in my shoulder, crying freely, holding on to me as tightly as she could. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a massive, warm embrace. I rested my chin on the top of her head, closing my eyes, and let out a long, heavy breath that I felt like I had been holding for decades. "I got you, sweetheart," I murmured gently, smoothing her hair just like I did when she was a little girl. "I got you. It is over now. You are safe." She sobbed against my chest, nodding slowly. We stood there together in the middle of the empty, glittering ballroom. The storm had finally passed. The liars had been exposed, the thieves had been locked away, and the people who thought they could trample on our dignity had been completely erased from our lives. We did not need their approval. We did not need their high society validation. We had the truth, we had our respect, and most importantly, we had each other. And as I held my daughter tight, I knew that was the only wealth in this world that truly mattered. 3 months have passed since the freezing water from Richard Sterling's crystal glass shattered against the marble floor of the grand ballroom. 3 months since a carefully constructed empire of lies was burned to the ground in front of 600 of the most elite families in the city. I am now standing in a sprawling corner office on the 42nd floor of a glass skyscraper in the heart of downtown Chicago. The floor-to-ceiling windows offer a panoramic view of the city skyline, reaching all the way down to the working-class neighborhoods of the South Side. Standing right next to me, looking out over the sprawling urban grid, is my daughter Maya. We are looking at a very specific plot of land in the distance. Down there, the small, weathered, one-story house where I spent decades wiping thick engine grease off my hands is completely gone. The old driveway where I taught Maya how to ride a bicycle has been torn up. In its place, the heavy, towering steel skeleton of a $200 million commercial plaza is rapidly rising from the dirt. Heavy cranes are swinging massive steel beams into place. Construction crews are pouring endless yards of concrete. It is the very same piece of dirt that Richard Sterling arrogantly called a worthless burden. It is the very same piece of land his cowardly son tried to extort from me in a dark catering closet to pay off his underground gambling debts. They looked at that neighborhood and saw nothing but poverty and decay. I looked at it and saw the future. The Sterling name no longer carries any weight in this city. It is spoken only in hushed, deeply embarrassed whispers at the exclusive country clubs they used to dominate. The great legacy of Sterling construction is completely dead and buried. When I invoked the morality clause and pulled that $5 million loan on the night of the wedding, it triggered a catastrophic, unstoppable chain reaction of financial defaults. The corporate sharks and the banking institutions swarmed in like vultures picking at a fresh carcass. Richard's corporate headquarters was seized by federal receivership within 48 hours. His assets were locked down, his active project sites were chained shut, and his heavy machinery was auctioned off for pennies on the dollar to satisfy his furious creditors. Richard was officially forced to declare total personal and corporate bankruptcy. He lost his sprawling suburban mansion. He lost his collection of vintage luxury cars. But most importantly, he lost his precious high society friends. The wealthy elite class does not tolerate failure, and they certainly do not tolerate a man who publicly picks a fight with an invisible billionaire and loses so spectacularly. The man who tried to humiliate me for the color of my skin and the calluses on my hands is now living in a tiny, cramped apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, drowning in legal fees and absolute obscurity. He learned the hard way that a legacy built on arrogance and prejudice shatters like cheap glass when it finally hits the concrete floor of reality. And then there is Connor. The golden boy did not get a polite slap on the wrist. He did not get to hide behind his father's money and make his problems quietly disappear. The federal prosecutors took one look at the digital trail Elias Thorne had uncovered, combined with the crystal-clear video confession I had recorded in the hotel corridor, and they did not offer a single moment of leniency. The trial was incredibly fast and entirely devoid of any high society glamour. Connor was completely abandoned by the violent criminal syndicate he owed money to, and without his father's frozen wealth to hire a team of elite defense attorneys. He stood in that federal courtroom entirely alone. The judge looked at the forged loan documents bearing my daughter's stolen identity and handed down a sentence that wiped the arrogant smirk off Connor's face forever. He was sentenced to 5 solid years in a federal penitentiary for aggravated wire fraud and felony identity theft. He traded in his custom-tailored Italian silk tuxedo for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He will spend the next half-decade in a concrete box, eating terrible food and sleeping on a thin mattress far away from the fine dining and the luxury lounges he thought he was inherently entitled to. But the most important victory of all is standing right beside me in this glass office. Maya did not let the betrayal break her spirit. She is my daughter, and she carries the same unbreakable iron in her spine that her late mother had. The marriage to Connor was legally annulled within a matter of weeks. Because the union was fundamentally built on extreme financial fraud and criminal deception, the courts completely erased the marriage as if it had never even existed. She shed the toxic Sterling name before the ink on the wedding certificate was even completely dry. Maya did not hide away in shame. She did not let the public spectacle of that night define her future. Instead, she stepped directly into her rightful place. Today, Maya is no longer just an architect grinding away long hours for someone else's corporate firm. She has officially taken over the urban development division of Blackwood Holdings. She is sitting on the executive board making decisions that shape the future of the city. She is holding a digital tablet right now, reviewing the architectural blueprints for the massive commercial center currently being built over our old neighborhood. She took the profound pain of that betrayal and forged it into an unstoppable, brilliant corporate ambition. She is designing a space that will bring jobs, opportunities, and life back to the community where she grew up. She looks powerful, confident, and entirely at peace. The conflict is completely over. The storm has passed, and the natural order of things has been fully restored. The liars have been stripped of their illusions, the thieves have been locked away in steel cages, and the people who thought they could trample on our dignity have been completely erased from the board. I look out over the vast city stretching out beneath us. I have spent my entire life keeping my head down, letting ignorant people underestimate me, letting them judge my simple clothes and my quiet demeanor. I let them believe I was just a tired old mechanic who had nothing to offer the world but sweat and manual labor. But I have never minded the silence. I have never felt the need to correct their arrogant assumptions. Real power does not need to show off. It does not need to wear a heavy gold watch, drive a flashy sports car, or shout from a brightly lit stage to demand respect. Real power is perfectly content to sit in the shadows, remain invisible, and observe the world with absolute clarity. It only speaks when it is finally time to step out of the dark and completely destroy the wicked.